Hello, my fellow Estorians. I'm Aziz. With me is Ashea, and this is Valar Rereadis. As we take on a feast for crows, Valar Rereadis seeks to entertain while preparing you for the Winds of Winter. Many of the new plotlines and locations launched in this book are not yet resolved, taking us to our greatest heights of mystery yet. For the remainder of the Valar Rereadis journey, we'll be looking ahead, if not more than we've been looking back. But the core message remains true.
The best books are those that hold up to repeated rereading. From George R.R. Martin.
Hey, and he said he finished 3 chapters this week. That's pretty cool. And we're doing 3 chapters this week. Coincidence? Yes. If you're watching live, you can feel free to ask live questions. You can also send questions and comments ahead of time by joining us on one of our social media platforms, Facebook, Flick, Discord, or Slack. A big thanks to our regular contributors. That includes Joe Buckley. His show is called Scraps and Scrolls. The official podcast name is Isle of Faces, but Scraps and Scrolls is his name, like Valar Rereadis is the name for History of Westeros' reread. And you can find his thoughts in our episodes, but you can also find his episodes for additional content, additional thoughts. Same goes for Nina Friel, whose thoughts can be found on Good Queen Alley. That's one with one L on tumblr.com. And her thoughts are throughout this episode and just about all other Valar Rereadis episodes. You can join us on Patreon if you want to support us financially. That's one of the best ways to support the show. Go to patreon.com/History of Westeros to check out the benefits, get access to bonus episodes. We've got a lot of bonus episodes. And things like access to scripts and occasional shout-outs, fun stuff like that. Today, the 3 chapters we have are Jaime 3, The Gang Meets Goldenhand the Just, a.k.a. Harrenhal, Third Time's Not the Charm.
Cersei 6, The Queen of Bones, a.k.a. the one with the faith militant Reborn.
And the Reaver, Conquest of the Shields, a.k.a. Euron's Shady Dreams. All 3 of these chapters have that every sentence is a rabbit hole feel to them, and they're long, which of course is part of why we're doing only 3 this week. Everyone's getting in on the mute character plan these days. Cersei isn't quite there, but she'll have Sir Robert Strong soon enough. I mean, it's only fair. He takes more work to prepare. It's easier or harder to do than simply cutting someone's tongue out. Like, Jaime has Sir Euron with him, who he can spill secrets around with no fear. Now, Varys might feel like everyone's getting in on his game using tongueless people, because the little birds are that, right? But Euron is right there with him, who gives Victarion the Dusky Woman in this chapter, and Victarion will proceed to tell secrets to her, like Jaime tells to Sir Euron. Heirs are a major topic, hidden or surprising heirs, captive or missing heirs, but not like Jon Snow, meaning we're not talking hidden parentage. We're talking hidden heirs. Not like Mance's baby, who's also hidden in the sense that no one knows where he is. What I mean is heirs who were previously not expected to inherit, perhaps because they're so far down the line of succession or because they have a different last name and it's not clear that they're actually the heir. Maybe their blood connection is distant, but because of so much death or other branches of another family dying out, lots of different ways this can happen. For example, Tyrek Lannister comes back around as a topic, and it's long been theorized that Varys has him stashed away as a claimant to Casterly Rock, and his order placement in the line of succession for Casterly Rock has just continued to rise as other things happen. Now, Victarion sees a big shakeup at the Shield Islands, where he himself slew the heir to South Shield, Sir Talbot Seri. Then with 4 new lords raised, there's a much bigger shakeup. Not just on the Shields, but back on the Iron Islands, because the heir to Harlaw, Sir Harris, a.k.a. the Knight, becomes Lord of Greyshield. Thus, Hotho Harlaw becomes the new heir to the Reader and Harlaw itself. And Victarion himself is made heir of the Seastone Chair to take when Euron gets the Iron Throne. This also came up in Elaine 1, of course, which we just did. Harry the Heir, obviously, is a big touchstone for this theme. He stands to inherit the Eyrie, though he bears the name Harding, not Aaron. And of course, we also discussed the Rosby inheritance last time, and the Stokeworth inheritance, that's in quotes, so to speak, with regards to Bronn. And in Samwell's chapter, through Aemon's memories of his father Maekar and his brother Aegon the Unlikely. So really, there's been a lot of this lately. Should have mentioned it last time, but better late than never. Though heir is not the appropriate term, nor succession, those terms do apply to what's happening loosely with the High Septon. We've got a new man in charge, the High Sparrow. We've already technically met him, but not as the High Sparrow, just as a person walking down the road. A similarity also exists elsewhere in Cersei's plot lines with regards to her being the queen, while a younger, more beautiful queen threatens to take her place, kind of like the heir to the title of most beautiful queen. While Jaime heads to the Riverlands with a squad that contains quite a few men who are heirs to castles in the West, many of whom became heirs because of deaths of fathers or brothers during the war. So, yeah, war has a way of reshaping lines of succession. Super chat from New Dad Podcast. Can't stick around, but watching later tonight. Wanted to stop in and support the best around. Well, thank you very much, Tommy. Make sure to check out the New Dad Podcast, especially if you're a new dad, but not only if you're a new dad. It's for everyone. Hey, I did an appearance on the show recently with a friend, River Shannon Aloya, and we had good talks about our upbringings, which are kind of unusual. So check that out if you're interested. Let's get going. Jaime 3. The gang meets Goldenhand the Just, a.k.a. Harrenhal. Third time's not the charm. A new look, Jaime returns to the region that changed him forever. He's returning to Harrenhal not for the third time in his life, but the third time in his POV chapters. This would be well more than 3 times that he's been there total. But since he's been a character as a POV, well, he went there the first time. Then he returned immediately for Brienne, who turned out to be in the bear pit. And that's where this chapter is going to end too, in that very bear pit. Now, he doesn't just look different, he acts differently. He's a totally changed man. There's still some aspects of his old personality, but he is definitely on a changing arc. Notice I say changing arc, which maybe isn't the best term, but I'm specifically not calling it a redemption arc. He's becoming a better man, but he's not actually trying to redeem himself for what he's done in the past. And this chapter is a good example of that, because he and his family, sure, it's Tywin and Tywin's Reavers that did most of the damage, but it's still his family that destroyed this Riverlands in the first place. He's not there to help the Riverlands recover. He's there to just stop them fighting, which might help them recover, but that's really not his goal. So again, Jaime's turning into a better person, but let's not call it a redemption arc. Unless he starts doing redemptive things. Maybe that'll happen. So this is the last third of the book that we're entering. Really, you could say that next week, 9, 10, 11, and 12. So we're about to enter the last third next week. But of the 7 chapters Jaime has in this book, notice that we're only on the third one. So he's going to have basically 5 chapters in this last stretch. And the longest Jaime chapter in all the books, period, is this one. And here's the first line.
I had hoped that by now you would have grown tired of that wretched beard.
We haven't mentioned the ghost theme in a few episodes, but here it is again, right on point, connecting with the Kingsguard. Quote again.
All the color is draining out of you, brother. You've become a ghost of what you were, a pale, crippled thing, and so bloodless, always in white. She flicked her hair away. I prefer you garbed in crimson and gold.
She means that literally and metaphorically. She doesn't like that he's taking his duties more seriously, being less of a Lannister, being more of a Kingsguard, but she also doesn't like this physical changes. She thinks he's actually getting whiter. He's turning gray in the beard, and he's probably not as healthy as he was. Anyway, it's very powerful, these repeated connections of the Kingsguard to the others, to ghosts, to the dead, because they don't have full lives. They've sworn away a lot of what makes a life, right? They can't love. They're or not allowed to. They do sometimes, because love is a hard thing to give up, even when you say you're going to. You're supposed to give up relationships. You're supposed to give up so much, and it's arguably makes you a lot less human. And well, those things fit quite well. Jaime's taking his duties more seriously, thus that does drive the wedge between him and Cersei even farther, even though this Kingsguard issue isn't nearly the only thing driving that wedge. It's certainly part of it. Nina suggests the opening of this chapter feels like a callback to Tywin's funeral in Cersei 2, which she thinks Lord Tywin would have wanted him in Lannister gold and crimson, she thought. It always angered him to see Jaime all in white. So basically she's sort of parroting her father there, but I'm sure it's not her father's opinion only. I think she genuinely agrees with her father, but it's interesting that they hold such a similar opinion. Tywin taught all his children to view Lannisters as inherently better than other people. And Cersei agrees with that. And she's very much bought into that family line there of superiority. But Jaime doesn't really, and they don't understand that. They don't really get why Jaime doesn't buy into this Lannister superiority. And symbolically, by becoming more of a Kingsguard, he is rejecting his Lannister side. The graying of Jaime's beard and the fact that he's holding on to the beard at all are both signs he is now growing apart from Cersei. Remember how much they used to look alike. They could even wear each other's clothes and pass for one another. It's a long time since that's been possible, and it's getting farther and farther from seeming like it could have ever been possible. I mean, Cersei could certainly not grow a beard. And of course, there's the missing hand, the changing way he dresses, not to mention just the way he feels internally and his attitudes towards his twin. Also worth pointing out is Cersei is herself becoming more like Robert personally, as she's calling him more like Robert. She's overeating, she's drinking heavily, she's kind of lazy in some ways, she's dismissive of problems. Meanwhile, she criticizes Jaime for looking like Robert, but she's acting like Robert, which is far worse. So, and we're going to see her act even more like Robert next chapter, which... Cersei 7, one of the nicknames for it is Drinking to Forget, which, heck, does that not scream Robert? The graying of Jaime's beard and the fact that he's holding on to the beard at all are both signs of how he's also growing apart from Cersei. This is almost like an intentional subliminal thing he's doing, or subconscious thing he's doing to distance himself from her. It's not just the differences between them, but yeah, the physical manifestations. It's really well done by George, approaching it from multiple angles. Joe Buckley notes that in the first 2 pages of this chapter, Jaime has his Lancel Osmond Moonboy mantra repeated 4 times, which Joe suspects might be the record. Maybe we'll have to look, but it's certainly a lot. When it finally comes to an end, all this arguing, all this fighting, and he leaves, is still the thing he's focused on, right? It's still beyond all the politics, beyond all Cersei's self-destruction, beyond her drinking and making terrible political moves. This is still the thing that gets him the most, which shows how personal it is to him and how wrapped up he is in his emotions towards her. Yeah, family and politics are second to his love for Cersei, even though he's actively losing his connection to her. Here's a quote.
The sun was warm on his back, and the wind rifled through his hair like a woman's fingers.
A woman's fingers. I mean, he's literally never been with another woman sexually. What is he thinking of, like his mom there? It's not Cersei's finger, a woman's fingers, but how many women have run their fingers through his hair? So that's just another subtle distinction of normally that would have been Cersei he's thinking of. Just the word would have been wind rifled through his hair like Cersei's fingers. I think if he had this thought 2 books ago, that's exactly how it would have been written. No coincidence that as he's departing from her, he sees the Tower of the Hand in the background, meaning the ruined, ashen mess that is the Tower of the Hand. So, yeah, that's very symbolic of where Cersei's headed and where their relationship is headed, too. And her eyes were green ice as she looked at him. That's a really quite interesting symbolism. If you recall, we noted really early on in the series that Cersei was very often described as icy. There was lots of snow and pale and white and cold associated with her, and that sort of dropped off a bit in the middle, but it seems to be coming back somewhat with this comments like this, green ice. That's pretty distinct, isn't it? Jaime is not entirely unaware of how emotional and how he kind of loses control a bit when it comes to her. Quote,
Somewhere, the gods were laughing. Cersei had never taken kindly to being balked. He knew that. Softer words might have swayed her, Yet, of late, the very sight of her made him angry.
Jaime prefers to stay in the capital, but without Kevin or anyone else trustworthy around, Cersei isn't wrong to want someone competent out in the field because, yeah, some of these campaigns are going poorly. River Run really should have been settled by now, but it hasn't been, which suggests that someone else needs to take charge. Now, he suggests, well, why don't you trust David Lannister? Well, David Lannister is already there, and he's not getting the job done. So it's actually a decent argument on Cersei's part, and it results oriented. If we're going to go that way, he does pretty much get the job done in every case. It's not a perfect success. After all, he lets Blackfish get away, but mostly he does what's required of him, and, setting aside ethics and morals as far as doing what the Lannister regime needs done, he does it for the most part. So it's a smart move by Cersei, I'd say, but it's also carrying on this evil their father unleashed. As I said, if you subtract the morals and ethics from it, he's getting the job done. But we can't really subtract that, can we? So he's really sealing the deal on what Tywin unleashed, kind of just putting the cherry on top of all that without really addressing that. He thinks about how the area is war-torn, and he thinks they're going to have problems, but he never really... Well, he does sort of blame his father for it, but he doesn't get angry about it. He just sort of says, yeah, well, this is what my dad did. The chapter is the first note from Jaime in this book about how famine is affecting and will affect Westeros. While food supplies are still decent near the capital, as Jaime realizes, that's going to become substantially less true the farther he goes along. And let's not forget, King's Landing isn't growing its own food, right? Everything they get, for the most part, is imported, either by ship or by wagon load. I mean, we already saw starvation in King's Landing earlier in the war. So, and that's not because, the farms in town were shut down. There are no farms in town. That doesn't happen. So war has not just demanded the food already stored away, meaning the winter stores have already been gone through quite a bit, but it's negatively affected those who made it through the war alive with any ability to offset those losses. They don't have money, they don't have anything they can trade for food, and food prices have gone up. So even if they did have some of their wealth left over after all the ravaging, it would still be really expensive and difficult to make ends meet in terms of having enough food for what's likely to be a very long winter. So starvation is going to be a huge theme. It's becoming a theme. And whenever you have starvation, you have cannibalism. And that is popping up in a lot of different plot lines. Some of it has already popped up. I mean, we've seen it beyond the wall. That's come up several times. We talk about Davos going to Skagos. We haven't actually seen that yet, but we've discussed the cannibalism there potentially. Here we hear about cannibalism of Vargo Hoat, being force-fed himself and being fed to Willis Manderley, who, poor guy, is about to go back north to White Harbor, where food is probably going to be in short supply there in not too long either, or as well. So this guy might go through the double whammy of cannibalism and starvation and extreme exposure to winter. Something we covered in the Winter's Coming to White Harbor episode. That's part 2 of the White Harbor / House Manderley series, which you don't have to listen to part 1. All of our part 1, part 2, part 3s tend to be individually, you can listen to them individually without having listened to the first part. They're better if you listen to the first part, but they work well as standalones as well. Jaime is bitter about certain aspects of his mission. As we said, he doesn't get mad at his father, but he realizes how much damage he did and how this probably wasn't necessary and how he doesn't need to be there. He'd rather be back in King's Landing, so that has nothing to do with Tywin. But he is, and like Adam Marbrand with him, there is a silver lining to it all, which is that they're both more comfortable out in the field on a horse with an army. They were raised as soldiers, like so many boys are raised in Westeros, and it's their comfort zone. Not the fighting part, just the campaigning part, traveling from place to place, eating out, being outdoors, all that stuff. Sure, they're comfortable with the fighting part too, but that's not what I'm talking about. This is a parallel to Victarion. He doesn't like carrying out Euron's orders but he's in his element out in the field, sailing and fighting, and it's like his comfort zone too. It's something we're going to talk about a lot, is these parallels between these archetypal characters that are similar in some ways and very different in other ways because of which culture they were born into, and as well as what family and other circumstances. Here he thinks how important it is to be careful with scouting after he and his uncle Stafford lost big thanks to surprise attacks by Robb Stark. Victarion, of all people, again comes up here. He had a somewhat similar thought about the silver linings to losing a battle that he commanded. He says, well, if you lose a battle early in life, you can learn from it and not repeat those mistakes. Jaime is doing that exact thing. He's like, I am not repeating that mistake. However, or is he? A bit of foreshadowing here. Quote,
Jaime had given stern commands that no man was to depart the column without his leave.
Well, no one does, for the most part, that we know of, except himself. He's going to very faithfully give himself leave to depart the column when Brienne shows up next book. So, well, the person who will surely take charge of looking for Jaime after he goes off with Brienne is this same man who was just in charge of looking for a different missing Lannister, which is Tyrek, and that's Sir Adam Marbrand, who was one of Jaime's close friends, and, you know, they're not as close as they were because of Jaime's hand and all that, but they've known each other a long time, and Sir Adam was the commander of the Gold Cloaks. He's very happy to not be doing that anymore. He's much happier out in the field, being with Jaime, scouting, riding a horse, all that. He's probably the most prominent member of the party, besides Jaime, of course. In addition to the City Watch, and most relevantly, he has extensive experience as a commander of scouts and outriders. So that's, of course, why he will be not only perhaps in charge of the company with Jaime gone, but the guy most skilled and experienced in searching for missing people. So, yeah, it's going to fall right to him. Speaking of Tyrek, Jaime thinks about him quite a lot and his disappearance, so we shall join him. Tyrek was the other squire to Robert Baratheon along with Lancel, so he might know some things. Now, he wasn't there for the poisoning, but still, Lancel might have told him or let it slip something. Who knows? And if not that, there's still other things he could know of. So this occurs to Jaime directly, that does, though a lot of other things don't. So we're kind of expanding on Jaime's thoughts here. We're digging deeper than he does. It's been a while since the riot back in A Clash of Kings, but this is what Jaime thinks about. And he recalls that they rode all the way to the docks to drop Myrcella off, sending her to Dorne, and then the riot started on the way back to the castle. And he notably thinks how Varys was not there and how Varys could have pretty easily grabbed Tyrek, or had people do that during the commotion. He also knows that Varys is Rugen. Really, Jaime is perhaps more than anyone else a source of clarity. Cersei's not a source of clarity. Victarion is, well, occasionally a little bit, but for the most part, he's being tricked. Sam is an intelligent man, but he's detached from some of these other plot lines, and he's unable to think through some of these things because he's got so much else going on. Jaime just very often goes in detective mode in this book, and it's really nice to have that. So along with Tyrek, he considers that perhaps Varys knew the riots would begin. So he is as on to Varys as anyone at this point. Too late, obviously, and too little. It's not like he's going to take all this information and figure out that, say, Aegon VI exists. But still, he's got more pieces of the Varys puzzle than most, if not anyone, at least right now. And that might matter for narrative purposes later. And of course, when I say anyone, I don't include people like Illyrio. I mean like out of POV characters. So it's a mystery how Varys would know a riot would start. But it's not terribly hard to see how it might have happened, how Varys might have started it. So Nina walks us through the details here. Consider that it was Joffrey, of all people, that was hit by dung during the riot, and that triggered it. Tyrion will later flat out accuse Joffrey of causing the whole thing. When they ride back to the castle and barely escape with their lives, he slaps Joffrey and accuses him of starting the whole thing by ordering the Hound to go kill the person that threw dung at him. Out of all the people to hit with dung, it just happened to be Joffrey, literally the only person that would start a riot by an order of magnitude. No one else is that dumb. Cersei, we've criticized her intelligence plenty of times, but she is nowhere near foolish enough to do that. In fact, she will, in her chapter, sense it coming from Sir Meryn and be like, don't do that. So really, I don't think anyone else in the procession would have even come close to making a mistake like this. So, but Joffrey very clearly would and did. Thus, it's peculiar, if not notable, that he was hit by dung and his extremely short temper, lack of discipline, exploded. I think this is predictable. He also has very little to no understanding of the danger of an angry crowd in the first place. So he's not intelligent enough to figure it out on his own, nor does he have the experience to have seen it happen. So it's really, if this is what Varys did, you can see, like, yeah, this is not a stretch at all. He targeted the person likely to blow up and get mad and knew that blowing up and being violent in front of a crowd that's already starving and angry, yeah, you can see where that will go. So, like, again, Jaime doesn't think it through to this degree that we're doing right now. So, but this is the right time to go through it and figure it all out as best as we can since he's on the topic. Another piece here is that Adam Marbrand, who is, of course, as I said, the one in charge of looking for Tyrek, didn't find him, noted that they didn't ever even find a body, which is pretty important. They did find the bodies of Aeron Santagar and Preston Greenfield. Now, they mentioned the possibility that getting rid of his body because they were worried about Tywin's revenge, but why would they know to do that? Why would commoners fear that? Why would they know he's Tywin's relative? I mean, they might, but why would they think they'd get blamed for it? It's not like they're going to know exactly who killed Tyrek. So it kind of, that explanation isn't very satisfactory. So I do think kidnapping is a pretty strong likelihood. There's a fuller explanation of the details and some more evidence in Nina's blog. Particularly check out the one entitled Heirs in the Shadows, which covers some of the other characters that we've discussed recently and will discuss as well. So a fuller explanation of some of that stuff. Definitely recommended. The remaining question, though, is why? Why did Varys do this? Well, having a Lannister for his new regime under Aegon VI makes a lot of sense. Someone that will be loyal to him rather than having to deal with existing Lannisters and all that. Having Lannisters that can flock to his banner, having a claimant. Of course, this was before he knew that Tyrion might be a longer-term ally. And from a meta perspective, the riot was written when George R. R. Martin was still planning on the 5-year gap. So Tyrek was very long-term planning back then. Not just by Varys, but by George. All that aside, with Tyrek on Team Aegon VI, and with Tyrion perhaps on Team Dany, this might actually come to a head. It might be Tyrek versus Tyrion or something like that. Don't think of the TV show because, of course, Varys and Tyrion were like on the same team on TV, but that is not how it looks likely to go in the books at all. Maybe, or if it is, it'll be temporary or under much different circumstances. Anyway, it's the first sighting of Jaime's new hand. For him, it's going to take some getting used to. He's not happy to put it on at first. He starts to get used to it. Joe Buckley points out he says he can't fight with it, but he does smack Red Ronnet Connington in the face with it, and that's pretty effective. Maybe Jaime will attach something else to it eventually. He thinks about how a hook would have been more useful. I don't know. It might be foreshadowing for a different attachment going on. I mean, some people have pointed out the Brotherhood without banners, even if he gets away from them or is let go because he wins his trial by combat, if that even happens, that they might confiscate his hand because it's golden, right? And they're like, well, we could use this and melt it down. I mean, he could just go have another one made, but he might opt for something else. So, yeah, that would be another way to have a new look for Jaime. He also, on his way out of town, learns a few other things in his detective mode. He's on the lookout for important information. He hears that people are calling Cersei's council the smallest council. Even outsiders recognize how weak it is and how stacked it is with yes men. He also notices something that's been going for a while, which is that the commoners are a lot bigger fans of the Roses than they are the Lions. And I don't think we really need to get deep into the reasons why. Jaime certainly is aware of it. I mentioned a few of the people he's traveling with that are heirs. Sir Adam is one of them. He's the heir to Ashmark. And the person that takes his place as watch commander of the Gold Cloaks, that would be Sir Osfrid. So finally the third Kettle Black. gets a job. We got one in the Kingsguard. We got one doing Cersei's dirty work, killing the High Septon, and maybe going to go up to the Wall. And now we got this guy commanding the City Watch, and he's perhaps the cruelest of them all. So that's awful to have someone with this kind of police authority being a really cruel guy. And of course, he's a Kettle Black. They're all pretty bad. We also have Sir Stefan Swift, heir to Cornfield. That's the son of Harry Swift, the clueless hand of the king that Cersei has, she'll demote to Master of Coin when Sir Giles dies. Then we have Sir Flemont Brax, who's the heir to Hornvale. We saw his father sink in the Battle of the Stone Mill when Edmure did his thing. And his older brother also died during one of the other battles in the War of Five Kings. So he was the third son, but now he's the heir. While riding, Jaime thinks of going to ask Sir Ilyn to come with him, and we get some interesting fodder for discussion indirectly related to the Silent Executioner. Quote,
The realm had not had a Lord Confessor since the second Daron, however, and the last chief jailer had been a cloth merchant who purchased the office from Littlefinger during Robert's reign. No doubt he'd had good profit from it for a few years, until he made the error of conspiring with some other rich fools to give the Iron Throne to Stannis. They called themselves Antler Men, so Joff had nailed antlers to their heads before flinging them over the city walls.
Yeah, Jaime's thinking about a lot of things that happened back in A Clash of Kings, it seems like here, right? But there's a lot of tidbits in this passage, like I said. Fire and Blood clarified that the position of Lord Confessor was the job of Chief Torturer. That's a real-world position as well. That's existed in medieval times and others, I suppose. Larry Strong served as Lord Confessor as well as Master of Whisperers at the end of Viserys I's reign, and he started his career at court as just one of the King's Confessors, like one of the lower level ones, and then rose to be the head one, as well as Master of Whisperers. When Unwin Peake took over the regency of Aegon III, he had George Graceford appointed Lord Confessor. So that's funny. Nina points out that this is the only character we have in all of the books or extended material named George. And then he made himself a torturer. I guess it's a little tongue-in-cheek because of what he does to all his characters. It's true, though, what Jaime thinks about Sir Ilyn, isn't it? That all he cares for is killing. He doesn't take care of himself or his surroundings, but he does take care of his sword extremely well. Talk about an isolated person, though. Illiterate and mute. You don't need to be a mental health expert to say that this kind of lack of human contact is not great. He has no relationships. He has no other interests. Yeah. Ilyn's grim, decaying room is about as fit a symbol of Lannister compliance as any. At the heart of it all, the Lannister regime's power rests on killing dissidents, and this is a regime that came to total power through murder of Robert, and then killing people like Ned and the Antler Men and the victims of the Red Wedding. This is a necessary job, a necessary person for the Lannister plan, an executioner, not a diplomat, not a lawmaker, a headsman, a violent enforcer of the regime's rule, a symbol of it too by the way he looks, not just his surroundings, because people don't see this. We readers do, but obviously the common people and even the other nobles don't know the squalor that he lives in, but they see what he looks like, and Jaime describes him as looking like death. I like the fact that this is some of Joe's really good takes here, that we find out about Ilyn Payne's lifestyle and how shallow and awful and empty it is after all this time of him out of the spotlight. It's a wonderful twist on the, quote, revenge of Ilyn's part in killing Ned. We're supposed to want bad things to happen to him because of what he did. He's been a fixture on Arya's kill list since the start. I mean, she did witness it. But we find out it's already happened. Like, this guy, he's already suffering, it seems like. Who needs... does this guy really need more abuse heaped on him when you see the way he's living? Like, he's miserable and isolated and has no friends. And yeah, that's pretty terrible. Joe writes, this is pretty much the polar opposite of Eddard Stark, who was a family man, had people respecting him, had lots of duties, had people caring about him and what he thought his legacy as well matters. People liked Ned enough to carry forward with that. All he has, Ilyn that is, as Jaime notes, is the act which we will despise him for in the form of this clean sword. And this is literally it. He lives for death. And that is kind of an opposite. He's like a mirror, the opposite sort of mirror rather than a reflection of Ned. We open the series on the scene of Ned having to behead someone, right? He took no joy in it. It was his duty. Ilyn did the same thing and is labeled as evil because he took the head of someone we like. Now, maybe Ilyn did enjoy it. After all, Jaime thinks he enjoys killing, that he lives for killing. But he hasn't killed anyone that wasn't condemned to death. He hasn't murdered anyone. He doesn't go around killing. He only kills people lawfully, which, you know, that maybe that sounds like too much of a defense of a guy who doesn't really need to be defended. But it's an interesting way to look at him as a person and to see these outcomes and to unpack the way we're judging. Because we can still judge this man awful, but realize that not all the things we're judging him for are actually awful. A lot of it's just being caught up in the system, like Ned is.
What do you think his other options are in life?
Exactly, right? He was captain of Tywin's guard before, where he may have been given that Tywin promoted him, he might have been kind of a scumbag. But once he lost his tongue, he couldn't have that job anymore, right? So yeah, you're right. He has very limited options in this life. So it's an interesting thing to think about. It's uncomfortable to think about, but it's another way to perhaps blame the system as much as or more than we would blame the individual. Again, we are putting some blame on the individual, but it's interesting and important to parse these things.
Yeah, I mean, if you think of him as the sword, it's harder to be mad at the sword than it is the wielder.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, I mean, he is basically just a sword, yeah. Except he is a human. So we mentioned this ahead of time, but now it's official. Jaime's in the Riverlands learning how to fight from Ilyn Payne, while Brienne is in the Riverlands teaching Podrick Payne how to fight. Something we've been keeping track of is just how many soldiers, Lannister soldiers, have been leaving the capital, going to Dragonstone, going here, going there. Now, this is another batch headed out. 40 nights doesn't seem like a lot until your city's under attack, and you realize that 40 is more than nothing. You got all these Westermen and Stormlords headed out, plus the Holy 100. Yeah, just a lot more people leaving. Meanwhile, more and more sparrows are filling in. Straight away, we find some remnants of the war in the burned Hall of the Woads when Jaime locates outlaws. Or are they broken men? Either way, Jaime takes action and decides he likes the feeling. Jaime believes he can come and do what is right. He might even enjoy it. But is it right? Brienne has just learned from Septon Maribald and will learn even more from Elder Brother that these are men to fear, yes, but also to be pitied. Jaime doesn't weigh that consideration at all. If he had, he might have still hanged them. But he doesn't even consider that they deserve pity. He hasn't considered, even though he thinks about it, he doesn't connect the dots that those men, these broken men, are probably where they are in large part because of the war started by his family, or at least the devastation started by his family. And this is not necessarily a slight on him, because Brienne didn't really fathom all this herself until she met Septon Maribald. And, well, Septon Maribald explained it really well. He's eloquent and convincing, and, well, not everyone has had access to his words. But I do like that Jaime is still keeping up with another duty. Speaking of Brienne here, he does ask about Sansa and about Brienne. He's still keeping her in mind, keeping them both in mind. Now, this is House Woad that's mentioned here as far as this castle, this earth and wood castle. We see Jaime says the Woads are nowhere to be found. We know where one of them is or was. One of the Woads was with Catelyn when she went to the inn and nabbed Tyrion, and that Woad followed her through the Vale and made it to the Eyrie. He was one of the survivors. So last we see, he's still there. I think he was in attendance to the duel of Bronn and Ser Vardis, but we have not seen him again. He probably stayed there because it was nicer, and he didn't want to have to make the return trip through the high road after barely surviving the first time. So Harrenhal, huge staple in our story. It's one of the most visited locations in all the books. It's right there with the wall in King's Landing and Winterfell. It's not quite that high, but it's probably the fourth or fifth most visited main location. And as far as number of chapters and different characters that go there. Interestingly, though, we won't be back for who knows when. This is the last time we see Harrenhal in all the books, but surely we'll be back, just don't know when. And this is the worst condition we've ever found it in, which is really quite a low bar. Harrenhal's never been in good shape at any point during the series. And, I mean, the guys who comes out to speak for the people living there is named Shitmouth. I mean, he's the messenger, right? So what? That just really, it's kind of symbolic of the sorry state of Harrenhal, right? Bonifer the Good. This guy is the leader of the Holy Hundred, and, well, as we like to do, when we have a quote that can explain, we use the quote rather than explaining. So we jump ahead to Daenerys, A Dance with Dragons, Barristan. I'm sorry, this is... I don't remember. Actually, I don't remember if this is this must be a Barristan. This must be a Dany chapter, not a Barristan chapter. Anyway, here's the quote.
The queen, your mother, was always mindful of her duty. He was handsome in his gold and silver armor, his white cloak streaming from his shoulders, but he sounded like a man in pain, as if every word were a stone he had to pass. As a girl, though, she was once smitten with a young knight from the Stormlands who wore her favor at a tourney and named her Queen of Love and Beauty. A brief thing.
What happened to this knight?
He put away his lance the day your lady mother wed your father. Afterward, he became most pious and was heard to say that only the maiden could replace Queen Rhaella in his heart. His passion was impossible, of course. A landed knight is no fit consort for a princess of royal blood.
So there you have it. Queen Rhaella, none other than Dany's mom, is the woman that this Sir Bonifer Hasty, leader of the Holy Hundred, had a thing for, and she apparently had a thing for him. But as Barristan explains, the culture would not allow it. Aerys married Rhaella, so that was that. According to Bonifer, any man might atone and be forgiven, but notice how he seems to mean that literally. Man may atone and be forgiven. He does not have any sympathy for Pia, and that stinks. And it's a good reason to think this guy, despite his cleanliness and his discipline and all that, isn't so great. Now, he's not necessarily a bad guy. He can be counted on to mostly behave. He's not certainly no Gregor Clegane or Vargo Hoat. He's better by far than the men who he's replacing. But that's, again, just like the state of Harrenhal, an extremely low bar to clear. Saying you're better than Gregor's men is really, I needn't have bothered. But Hasty, as you'll see, has a lot in common with Victarion when we get to his chapter. Joyless, zealous, misogynist, and he's going to go Victarion's going to go chase after a Targaryen who is beneath his station or above his station, while Bonifer has that in his past. Lots of things they have in common. Plus the 100 part, right? Bonifer has a holy 100, and Victarion has 100 ships in the Iron Fleet. So he's also a sharp contrast to Maribald, who in Brienne's next chapter will talk about forgiving. Even Sir Quincy Cox, who stayed behind his walls while Saltpans was brutally savaged by the Bloody Mummers led by Rorge, or some Bloody Mummers. I hardly can call them that anymore, but whatever. It's guys who were in that group. And yeah, so it's just really bad. Like, you see, Maribald will forgive Quincy Cox, but this guy, Bonifer Hasty, can't forgive Pia and wants to kick her out of her home. Like, Jaime thinks this is pretty bad, but he's not going to argue. He's like, yeah, well, we can give her a better job. We can be better for her to be with someone that doesn't hate her. Much worse, though, we brought up Willis Manderly and eating Vargo Hoat and all that. So we can think about that in connection to the phrase as well, since it's a reversal. Obviously, Wyman Manderly is going to trick people into eating human flesh, although he's going to eat some himself in the process, perhaps having learned that his son had done the same. And yikes, that's, yeah. There's a lot of cannibalism around the Manderleys, isn't there? Yep. Okay. Jaime brings up the point about not wanting to take up arms against the Starks or Tullys due to the oath he swore, but he doesn't really counter Cersei's point that this was a drunken promise made at sword point, and he thinks that himself at the beginning of A Storm of Swords. It's like, is this vow really valid? And I would argue he's right. Is it really valid? I mean, it's not a promise if someone forces you to promise, is it? I think that is the same as like forcing someone to sign a contract at gunpoint. It's not really a valid signature. But even if he doesn't literally wield his sword against them, leading an army into their territory, I think that counts as taking up arms. I do not think you've skirted the technicality on this one, Jaime. So anyway, we'll be talking about this more as he actually gets to River Run and has to confront his vow a little more directly. These wolves that are mentioned by Bonifer Hasty and others are going to continue to cause troubles for Lannisters, most likely, perhaps intentionally, if Nymeria has Arya in her head or just remembers. It's not quite clear. It's another piece of detective work by Jaime when he specifically thinks, I wonder if this is the same wolf that, from the Starks. And he's absolutely right. It is the same wolf. So once again, Jaime is a source of clarity. Let's see here. Connington. This is really interesting. We got a direct quote from George himself. This is from an SSM. And it's talking about the situation with Red Rod at Connington, how this used to be a powerful house, but they're not anymore. And, well, what changed?
I wish I could do a George voice, but here we go. Connington is a special case, and you have the essence of it. Details are made clear in A Feast for Crows. When Jon Connington was defeated at the Battle of the Bells, Aerys exiled him and stripped his house of all its lands and wealth. After the rebellion, Robert restored the castle to a cousin of Lord Jon's, but only the castle, and some small grounds around it. The extensive Connington lands were parceled out to others, and the house's wealth remained in the treasury. Nor was Robert willing to recall Lord Jon from exile, since he had been among Prince Rhaegar's closest friends. Thus, the Conningtons were once great lords, but Red Ronnet, their present head, is simply a landed knight, the Knight of Griffin's Roost.
Similar concept applied to Harrenhal. We discussed how Harrenhal, if it controlled more of the surrounding lands around it, would be able to support itself and thus be very powerful and perhaps dangerous, which is why many different kings, including even Robert, who this was probably someone else's advice, I doubt he thought of this on his own, have sort of hamstrung Harrenhal by keeping its surrounding lands small so that it can barely support itself, or not support itself. Similar case here, except for without the financial ruin. Great theory by Nina here, suggesting that perhaps Davos, his Seaworth lands, came from this redistribution of Connington lands, because it did happen at the same time. After all, this was right after Robert's Rebellion, and which at the end of the rebellion is when Davos was able to get through the cordon and rescue Stannis from siege. So his reward came right after this. So it fits extremely well since the Seaworth lands are in the Stormlands. Yeah, that's a really good catch. We finally learned the full story of Brienne. We know it pretty well. It's not something that needs the details are straightforward enough. Red Ronnet was yet another jerk, but worse probably than the others. I mean, he said that line to her about, this is the only thing you'll ever have from me, when she was 12. He said that to a 12-year-old girl. I mean, damn, that is rough. So no wonder she particularly doesn't like him, even more so than some of the others. He was worse. He was one of the actual betrothed rather than the ones just playing that game, which was bad too, obviously, but they weren't betrothed, and that she wasn't as young and as sensitive probably. So that has been something that she's not forgotten, and it's kind of nice to see. I'm sure she would approve of Jaime smacking him in the face. It's strange too. I mean, the guy it's cruel, but he as well, obviously, but he also just lies. It's weird. He says she's hairy. She's not hairy. I mean, I don't get that. He's just making things up about her. I mean, I don't know. She's not hairy. So it's also important that this is the last chapter that Jaime will ever call Brienne ugly. Very hard to catch that. You got to really be on the lookout. He's just going to think of her, nor wench. He hasn't called her wench in a long time. Now, from now on, it's only Brienne. That's a pretty big change, but very subtle and easy to miss, right? And even if you do catch it eventually, you may not know exactly where that point turns, where the last one occurs. Some super chats. One from Amy Blackfire. Thanks for all your hard work, Aziz and Ashea. Thank you too, Amy. Amy's been writing some great essays. You can find them on her Twitter, or I think they're posted in our Facebook group as well. So check them out. Very analytical. Some good stuff on the. I think the most recent one I read was on the Five Forts. Ainsley Mecklejohn Griffiths sends a super chat as well. Pink-haired stank sticker. That's cool. Appreciate that, Ainsley. Dornish Dame says, Jaime likens the wind to, quote, a woman's fingers here, but in Storm, he compares it to Cersei's fingers. Exactly what I was thinking. I'm glad. Thank you for the example. For the precise time, I was thinking it would be Cersei, but I didn't have an exact example, and now we do. And this, Dornish Dame also points out that this is a mirror to Brienne, specifically thinking less of Renly. He's starting to fade a bit from her mind. He's not probably going to ever fade entirely, but she's losing some of that connection. Time is healing that wound, I suppose. N. Kirk Evans says, Learned Hands pod talks about this. Duress is a defense against a contract. On the other hand, almost all contracts involving wars, hostages, etc. are under duress. If that logic were followed through, the whole system of treaties would fall apart. Interesting. So whether Jaime's agreement was invalid because of under duress, similarly, Cleos Frey was under duress when he agreed to return as a hostage, but the whole realm would have considered him forsworn if he abandoned the oath. Okay, great point. And this is a good reason to listen to the Learn Hands pod. It's a new show. Both of them, Maester Mary and Clint of the Laughing Tree, are real-life lawyers, so they really know their stuff. They really know the ways to think through these problems. That just didn't occur to me. I wouldn't have thought of how it applies to other similar situations, which is something that is at the heart of legal understanding. Everything, all cases get related to other cases. That's the whole point of precedent and things like that. This isn't necessarily an example of precedent, but it could be cited as precedent if it were used, or if it had happened, or if Jaime tried to get out of an oath because of it. So, great point, and good shout out to Learn Hands Pod. Check them out. We'll surely have them on as a guest at some point in the future. Probably not till after Valar Rereadis, but maybe before that, if we come up with some particularly interesting topic that we just have to cover. But surely it'll happen eventually. Jaime remarks how Sir Loras doesn't stare at Cersei's chest like Sir Osmond does. Yeah, well, he doesn't stare at any woman's chest, probably. They love to just dance around Sir Loras' sexuality without anyone... he knows, because he made that comment about Renly, but Cersei doesn't know that Loras is into men, so it's just like Jaime not telling Cersei about Rugen being Varys. It's like he doesn't tell her some of these things. Not that this one is nearly as important, but anyway. Paul Berry from Patreon with a great take here. It's important to notice not just what is going on, but what isn't going on. Along the lines of Jaime thinking less about Cersei romantically, Renly doing the same, or Brienne doing the same with Renly, Jaime does not hate Tyrion. He thinks about him not that often and doesn't think of him with extreme bitterness or hatred like TV Jaime did. He treats him like, in Paul's words, I like it. He treats him like a mate that played a trick on him. Oh, you got me with that Moon Boy, Lancel, Osmond Kettleblack thing. Yeah, I don't believe that. Instead of, killing his son and his father, which is that was more than a trick. But I guess that's partly because Jaime didn't really love his father or his son. That's part of it. But it's still very interesting to note that, it's still the thing that bothers Jaime the most is Cersei cheating on him. Aegon VI, also from Patreon, points out Cersei telling Jaime it seemed like all the color was draining out of him, the graying beard thing, is specifically tied to the Lannister colors. It's not the colors draining out of him elsewhere. It's just the crimson and gold. And then he proceeds to prove her right. He wants to take her, as he's done countless times before, but doesn't. He doesn't want to wear his gold hand, but does relent, and even openly tells Cersei of the oath he made to Catelyn. So he's just bringing up all these other points that relate to loyalties and promises that he made that matter, that wouldn't matter if he was just strictly being Kingsguard. But he's sort of citing them as evidence that he cares about these other promises while falling off on his promises and obedience to House Lannister. Archmaester Rennie, also related to a Loras quote here, he points out the line, "Loras is thrice the man Sir Osmond is," which is answered by Cersei, "and your notions of manhood have changed somewhat." And Rennie says, "Yes, good. It's good that Jaime's notions of manhood have changed somewhat. Yeah, we agree." But Stefan B jumps in with, "Saying Loras is thrice the man Sir Osmond is basically like saying Loras is worth all 3 Kettle Blacks," which, yeah, where's the lie? Bran Winslow cites the line of half man, whole man, which actually this line is in Cersei 6, not Jaime 3 here, but we can cover it here because it's related enough, and it relates to Jaime. She cites Mark Mullendore, who lost half his arm, is what good is half a man, which, hey, your brother is the same, right? He lost half his arm, and is he half a man? And of course, that also ties in with the concept of Tyrion, who is called half man. And so Cersei's kind of slamming them both there. Also, a nice catch there with the comment, "I have no wish to kiss him," from Sir Bonifer Hasty when Jaime says, "Kill him, blah, 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 kiss him," etc. Well, that's interesting because the kiss of death, or the kiss of life, rather, is associated with this comment, meaning, we have Beric, we have Sandor, we have Gregor, we have all that. So is this perhaps just a jokey nod to the concept of the kiss of life? Or is it foreshadowing that more undead will plague him, or that Bonifer Hasty will be killed by the person who received the kiss of life? Something like that. Something to be on the lookout for. Acre Frey says, "Jaime may have probably been on the receiving end of Loras's looks where Cersei hasn't, so maybe that plays into it." Hey, that's possible. I don't know about that, though, because Renly, he seems to not be interested in anyone now that Renly is gone. But maybe that's changing.
I mean, when did Loras and Renly get together?
Yeah, not many times.
Yeah, I could easily see Loras having some crushes on people when he was younger.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Also, more evidence of the metaphorical connection to the others and death. Archmaester Emma with a great take. Sir Ilyn is kind of like death. He thinks of him as like death riding beside him, which is an interesting thing to pair with the Kingsguard others symbolism and the ghost theme. And as they're training together, the line, he looks, his eyes are like cold as ice on a winter lake. Like, hello, others, right? So that's really powerful. And Tree Girl adds to this by saying they dance with him and they dance together in the moonlight, because Jaime specifically calls it dancing over and over. They're dueling, they're practicing, they're training. So that is really strong others theme there. Relating the executioner to the others makes sense. I mean, the others are if the supernatural elements we've been led to believe are true, which is that they were created by the children to kill men, then they are executioners of men. They may not have much other goal than that, which they live to kill. That does sound like what we just described with Sir Ilyn. So nice. On the other hand, let's have some good news to round out this chapter. This is TV show related, but it's also just humanity. Let's talk about Wilko Johnson. Wilko Johnson is the actor that played Sir Ilyn Payne on the show, Season 1 and Season 2. Now, he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer during Season 2 or after Season 2. And pancreatic cancer is one of the most deadly forms of cancer. However, it was one of those rare misdiagnoses. It wasn't that he didn't actually have pancreatic cancer, but he did have a huge tumor in his pancreas. And he went on a farewell tour expecting, because the doctor said he wouldn't live more than a year. But after the misdiagnosis was addressed, he still had to have massive surgery. He had to have like a 3-kilogram tumor removed from his gut. And it involved taking out parts of his intestine and his stomach. They had to kind of rewire his system down there. But that was in like 2013 or 14. He's still alive. He's still going. He's still touring. He's still playing music. The man is a great feel-good story, and he's a great musician. If you're a guitarist, look this guy up, Wilko Johnson. He has a really unusual playing style, and There's videos with him playing with like Roger Daltrey and all these other famous musicians. He's just a interesting guy. So check him out if you're interested in that. I hope I inspired a few of you to learn a little more about Wilco Johnson. And with that, we move on. Cersei 6, the Queen of Bones, aka the one with the Faith Militant Reborn. In terms of imagery, this one has a strong claim over all the other Cersei chapters, which is really saying something because the competition is stiff. In terms of her succession of mistakes, however, that's also stiff competition, but I really don't know that there's a bigger one than the rearming of the Faith. Though we have yet to see the full extent of that mistake, we already know it's been huge. And here is the quote to start it off.
Let me just say real quick, Cersei really is the Queen of Bones, is what Jaime would say right now. Anyways. Okay.
Zing.
Quote, "It was a slow climb to the top of Visenya's Hill."
And of course, I call her the Queen of Bones here because of all the skulls and bones piled up around Baelor's statue, which she tries to blame on, the other factions, but her family has as much to do with it as anyone, and her specifically has a decent bit to do with it. And this is what her regime represents quite a bit. Visenya, though, is mentioned right there in that first sentence. Visenya was a striking and powerful queen, an architect of her brother's power, and Cersei has a few things in common with her, but comes up well short in other areas. Certainly Visenya was a lot smarter, and a warrior, and a dragon rider. Yeah. Anyway, a very violent son who was also king, though. They have that in common. Joffrey and Maegor the Cruel, both given Valyrian steel very young, harmed animals and people from a young age. You could tell there was something not quite right about them. In addition to giving off serious Joffrey vibes, Maegor also gives off Gregor Clegane Robert Strong vibes. A huge man who was fearsome in and out of combat, brutal and cruel. Like Gregor, Maegor was once seemingly killed, staying barely alive in a comatose state, only to rise when care of him was given over to a person rumored to use black magic. To bring this back to Cersei, well, Maegor, after rising again and recovering his strength, mounted Balerion, flew on over to Rhaenys' Hill, not Visenya's Hill, Rhaenys' Hill, and burned the Sept of Remembrance. Well, that's why this Sept is on Visenya's Hill, because the other Sept, the Sept of Remembrance, was rebuilt by Maegor to be the Dragon Pit. If we want to entertain the notion of Cersei blowing up Baelor's Sept on the sister hill here, Visenya's Hill, right? Well, let me tell you just how easily it could be set up. The Guild of Pyromancers just so happens to have their home at the base of Visenya's Hill, and they have tunnels. Most certainly those tunnels go beneath the hill, thus below the Sept. So let me spell that out if it wasn't clear. We got wildfire, we got tunnels, we got beneath Baelor's Sept. I'm just saying. Now, time for some parallel lives, as Book Cersei would be trotting familiar ground if she did something like Show Cersei, but that's not who I'm referring to. Again, well, this is Maegor stuff. But more so than that, we have Cersei walking from atop Baelor's Hill, back to the Red Keep, atop Aegon's Hill. He's not likely to be a fan of the place. Now, Joffrey executing Ned isn't a great memory for her either. It's not what she wanted, and it put her in a bad spot. But obviously the High Sparrow is able to kind of use it as evidence. One might say she looks at Baelor's Sept in a manner similar, as in if Baelor's Sept burns, and it probably will, though it may not be because of Cersei, it may be because of an accident, Dany setting off the wildfire. There's a lot of ways this could happen in the, that reflect the show without being the same and being different, but touching sort of similar points. Either way, it looks like foreshadowing for the fates of the Sparrows, whether they blow up from wildfire or burn from Dany's dragon setting off wildfire or directly because of that. Who knows? This line, though, sounds like it might be foreshadowing the fates of many Sparrows.
There are 7 hells. Any one of them will serve.
And that is what she thinks in response to where shall all the Sparrows go, Your Grace. She might be more than right if she knows they'll end up burned by wildfire, dragonfire, or even regular fire could get them. Who knows? So I'll say this for Cersei. She survived the riot, but doesn't seem to have been traumatized by it. A mixture of arrogance and bravery then carries her on foot through the crowds. Sir Meryn, this guy is indeed not so bright. He starts to draw his sword, and she's like, "Don't do that, you moron." Her speech to the Sparrows outside is straight from the political playbook, the politician's playbook for all time. claim that you've just learned of the problem and then blame it on your enemies, which is a weird thing to do if you are just learning of the problem. Like, how can you know it was them if you didn't know it was a problem? But also, how could you not know it was a problem? The crowd is not fooled. They know too well, many of them personally, that lions have caused this damage as much or not, if not more, than Stannis or the Northmen, who she tries to pin it on. And if it was them, why didn't you stop them sooner? Why aren't you already dealing with this? Why aren't you protecting the faithful? Why aren't you protecting the sparrows? Quote.
The realm is full of kings. For the faith to exalt one above the rest, we must be certain. 300 years ago, when Aegon the Dragon landed beneath this very hill, the High Septon locked himself within the starry sept of Old Town and prayed for 7 days and 7 nights, taking no nourishment but bread and water. When he emerged, he announced that the faith would not oppose Aegon and his sisters, for the crone had lifted up her lamp to show him what lay ahead. If Old Town took up arms against the dragon, Old Town would burn, and the High Tower and the Citadel and the Starry Sept would be cast down and destroyed. Lord Hightower was a godly man. When he heard the prophecy, he kept his strength at home and opened the city gates to Aegon when he came.
So I think this is foreshadowing several plot lines here. So first of all, relating this to the faith just not buying Cersei's argument, what we can see is what that might lead to is them rejecting her and her whole house, especially if they can out Tommen for his parentage or something along those lines. So what we could see here is potentially them opening the gates to one dragon. Aegon the Sixth in this case might be what they're talking about. This might be the foreshadowing here. However, it could also foreshadow them not opening the gates to Dany and it burning because of it. Now, in this story, we're talking about Old Town, but it's the same thing. We can apply this logic to King's Landing. But we can also apply it to Euron. If they don't open their gates to Euron, which they're, of course, not going to open their gates to Euron, it could be destroyed. It could be burned down. And it might even be because he has a dragon. So if Old Town takes up arms against the dragon, well, if that's Euron and his dragon, Old Town would burn. So you could see how this anecdote both explains or perhaps foreshadows the fate of both Old Town and King's Landing and all the three main leaders who will take us through that procession of events. Euron, Aegon the Sixth, Daenerys. Very interesting, I think. Compare the High Sparrow to Sept and Maribald here. They have a lot in common, yet a lot not in common despite this. This is very interesting, I think. Look at the similarity in these quotes. First off, this one.
Most have lost their homes. Suffering is everywhere, and grief and death. Before coming to King's Landing, I tended to 100 little villages too small to have a septon of their own. I walked from each one to the next, performing marriages, absolving sinners of their sins, naming newborn children. Those villages are no more, Your Grace. Weeds and thorns grow where gardens once flourished, and bones litter the roadsides.
Now, here's Maribald.
Maribald was a septon without a sept, only one step up from a begging brother in the hierarchy of the faith. There were hundreds like him, a ragged band whose humble task it was to trudge from one's fly speck of a village to the next, conducting holy services, performing marriages, and forgiving sins.
Pretty much the same now, except for Maribald says when he goes out, he's still got villages to go to. Apparently, the ones the High Sparrow was going to when he was just a regular sparrow aren't there anymore. He talks about how those villages are gone. Now, also the way they look. It's not just in their upbringing, their background. It's also just kind of their appearance. So, and specifically the things that people notice about them and use to look down on them, especially people like Cersei and Taena. So, for example, Maribald. Sure.
I was falling down. Alrighty. His hands were large and leathery, with red knuckles and dirt beneath the nails, and he had the biggest feet that Brienne had ever seen, bare and black and hard as horn.
And Taena says of the High Sparrow, "My lord husband tells me this new one was born with filth beneath his fingernails." Yep. And Cersei, his feet are bare. She saw with dismay. They were hideous as well. Hard and horny things, thick with callus. There you go. Horny feet. Remember the Hornfoot
I'm
man
sorry,
who
they're
lived beyond the
hard
wall?
and horny.
Yeah. So in case you're suspecting they might be the same person, they definitely can't be. Brienne already met the High Sparrow on the road, and then she met Maribald. She would surely have noticed if they were the same person. Also, Maribald is large, while the High Sparrow is small. So the point isn't that they might be the same person. It's that they come from the same circumstances, have seen the same things, but take entirely different paths with regards to what to do about it. In other words, how they react to the demolishing of the Riverlands, this ravaging of so many people, they take very differently. Perhaps biggest of all, they have some very different attitudes towards violence. The High Sparrow is most surely more ruthless than Maribald by an immeasurable amount, rather. Plus, he's got a much more political mind. He's probably just a lot smarter than Maribald, at least as far as these things go, but Maribald is far more humble. The High Sparrow is withholding the coronation because of all this money owed by the Lannisters. He's using the best leverage he has, but I don't think he expected to get nearly as much as he actually got out of this leverage. The High Sparrow is a very, very serious person, clearly, yet I kind of imagine like cartoons and going off in his head when Cersei's like, what if we restore the faith militant? He's probably like, keep a straight face, keep a straight face, keep a straight face. I don't know if even he thought he could get that much out of her, because it's wild that she suggested it. But he sort of led her to that. Basically got her to say that by bringing up like, well, if we could protect, we can't protect ourselves, but you're supposed to do that. And of course, Cersei and her endless shirking of duties or passing things off. She's like, well, you could do that yourself. Now, it's not that Cersei getting all this money and the coronation aren't valuable. It's just they are. It's just that because the coronation's been shown to be incredibly important in terms of establishing legacy and legitimacy. It's just that she did not have to give up nearly that much. She's putting, and the things she's spending the money on makes the whole thing worse. She's putting all this financial, all the paybacks, paying back the Iron Bank, paying back the Faith. She's doing all this to build a new fleet, even though the Red Wine fleet is perfectly cromulent. She just doesn't trust it. There's not a good reason for her not to trust them. Like, they're still going to follow her orders openly. So she's spending money to avoid a problem that doesn't exist and creating new problems, big new problems in the process. Cersei's deal with the Faith is obviously very bad, Nina writes, but it's particularly bad when Cersei has every reason to know that the Faith can and will be hostile to the Lannisters. They were just openly blaming her for the problems just outside the Sept. The rank and file were calling her out for not protecting them. And they even called her out for saying, I'll avenge your dead. She's like, we don't want our dead avenged. We just want protection for the living. It's not that the Lannisters have been notorious in ravaging the land during the war, or not just that the Lannisters have been notorious in ravaging the land during the war, and everyone knows it. It's not just that the Lannisters are connected with grievous crimes in the eyes of the Faith, like Ned's execution and the Red Wedding. Cersei knows Tommen is a bastard born of incest, and has reason to know that a very large segment of the population knows or suspects this. So she's arming someone who could turn around and use this against them. Hardline Faith adherents are not going to support a boy known to be a bastard born of incest, even if it's not true, which we know it is. The rumor would be enough to potentially take Tommen down if the rumor was spread by enough people, if enough powerful people believed it and, acted on it. On the other hand, look to how much better Aegon's going to look. Again, they're going to open their gates to the dragon. This would be the one that makes sense. Compare him to Tommen, not born of incest. Well, probably not born of incest. And because he's supposed to be the son of Rhaegar and Elia. So that's perfectly all right in terms of the story being presented. And yeah, so like he just looks a lot better as a candidate. He's he's closer to being an adult. He's not associated with Cersei and all this violence. It is truly an epic mistake. I don't know how you can meet this guy, the High Sparrow, check out how zealous he is, make a read on his personality as you meet him in person, and then see all that mass of people angry and not happy with her, balking her authority, and think, yeah, let's arm them. Let's arm them as much as they want to be armed. Really, all she probably had to do was like, okay, I'll start paying y'all back. I'll resume the payments. That's probably all it would have taken to get the coronation. But nope. She just undervalues the faith militant restoration. Or if she was gonna do it, she could have gotten more from him. By the way, this blessing / coronation of Tommen hasn't actually happened unless it happened off page, like before the Mercy chapter or something. As far as we know, it hasn't even happened. So that's wild. She didn't even get her end of this terrible deal. We do agree with Cersei on one point when she gets mad about the concept of Baelor and imprisoning his daughter or his sisters because he was tempted by them. I mean, come on. If you look at the details, it's really absurd. It's right up there with Bonifer Hasty, the same type of ridiculous misogyny that is unjust, the way it's applied to men versus women. Like,
yeah, it's cloaked in faith.
Yeah, it's cloaked in faith. It's all bull. Right? He's like, he says his sisters would tempt him into, thinking of sex. One of them was 11.
It's ridiculous. Ridiculous.
Well, who's gonna... Let's say it's true that they did tempt him. Well, at least wait till she's not 11. I mean, come on. It's so absurd. Like, there is no defense for this whatsoever. And he denied them agency. He denied them this and that. And one of them bought into it. One of the three sisters bought into this whole thing. Is like, yes, I'm going to be a good little scepter. The other one, the oldest, was Dana the Defiant. So clearly by that name, she didn't. That's the mother of Daemon Blackfyre, of course. So, and of course, he brings this up to say Baelor forgave his enemies, and she's like, well, maybe he did. However, he was still there were many major criticisms to level on this man. On the other hand, Cersei, it just goes to show how bad she is. Not that we need more evidence of it, but when she thinks back on when she learned this, when she hears about this historical fact, she goes and pinches her brother's penis until he screams. Like, what? It's not his fault. Like, she's blaming men for it, I guess, which is fair, but not that man. That's a little infant. Like, what? So, this is typical of Cersei, though. When she wants to get her anger out, when she believes she has the right to do that with just about anyone. It doesn't matter who the victim is. She, as a superior person, has the right to vent her anger on anyone. So as terrible, back to Maegor for a second, as terrible a king as he was, keeping the most zealous element of the continent disarmed was a decent idea, actually. The implementation of the idea of disarming the faith was brutal and undeniably unjust and immoral. So maybe it's one of those things that's only a good idea in theory because there's maybe no way to do it without massive bloodshed. It was the problem with the execution was all the executions. So, worse for Cersei, she knows all this. She gives the history lesson to Taena, which shows that she understands. Well, she doesn't understand. She has the facts, but she doesn't seem to grasp them fully. Why all this matters is lost on her. And here it is, quote.
They date from before Aegon's conquest, Cersei explained to her. The warriors' sons were an order of knights who gave up their lands and gold and swore their swords to his high holiness. The poor fellows. They were humbler, though far more numerous, begging brothers of a sort, though they carried axes instead of bowls. They wandered the roads, escorting travelers from sept to sept and town to town. Their badge was the seven-pointed star, red on white, so the small folk named them stars. The warriors' sons wore rainbow cloaks and inlaid silver armor over hair shirts, and bore star-shaped crystals in the pommels of their long swords. They were the swords. Holy men, ascetics, fanatics, sorcerers, dragon slayers, demon hunters. There were many tales about them. But all agree that they were implacable in their hatred for all enemies of the holy faith.
Lady Merryweather understood at once. Enemies such as Lord Stannis and his Red Sorceress, perhaps? That is tongue-in-cheek. Indeed, Lady Excuse me. Indeed, Lady Merryweather understood at once, all right. She understands the enormity of this move, but also understands why Cersei thinks it's smart. It's not smart, but she gets Cersei's thinking and immediately speaks to it and makes it seem like she agrees, which she almost certainly doesn't. So what Cersei's trying to do is, before potentially destroying them or thinking about destroying them, if that's indeed what happens, she's going to try to make them work for her. But yeah, indeed, she thinks that specifically, and she thinks that's what Maegor should have done. Quote,
"Instead of taking the swords out of the hands of the faithful, he should have used them for his own ends."
This is that very concept we hear about later with regards to dealing with prophecy. Prophecy is a sword without a hilt. I think trying to get a zealous group of faithful to do what you want and to not lose control and to expect that to go well is wielding a sword without a hilt. You're going to cut yourself as much as you cut anyone else. It's self-destruction, mutual destruction, not something you can control and manage to work for you. So after that, there is more to consider. What about that reference there? Sorcerers? They were swords, holy men, ascetics, fanatics, sorcerers, dragon slayers, demon hunters. That's a strange thing to apply to these guys. But notice how we saw this specific thing happen when Brienne was with those two goofy hedge knights, Sir Illifer and Sir, what's his name? The chicken guy. I can't believe I'm forgetting his name. Sir Creighton Longbow, yeah. And, excuse me, saying his name.
All I could think of was Harry Swift because of his rooster sigil, obviously. I'm like, oh.
Yeah, exactly, right. So, those two, the group of sparrows is like, you should escort us. We have no one to escort us. That's what the warrior sons would have done if they existed. And they're like, nah, we got to go this other way. We got to earn a living. So, more to consider, though. If we think this whole thing through, right? Cersei's thinking about Stannis and Melisandre and how they need to be taken care of. But the real concern, if she was aware of it, would be Daenerys. Worshippers of R'hllor in much larger numbers could be coming to Westeros, and they'll certainly be armed, and they'll be of the belief that Daenerys Targaryen is Azor Ahai, the savior, the prophet, all that business. And when two groups of zealots clash, well, I'm not 100% sure that'll happen because maybe the faithful have been put down before the R'hllorists show up. But if they don't, boy, could that be a powder keg. Talk some more about Taena Merryweather. There's a lot more evidence that she's lying to Cersei. We've gotten some before this chapter. There's plenty here, too. Some of the most important, probably. She brings up this anecdote of Margaery and Renly. She implies Margaery slept with Renly without stating it all outright, though she points to the lack of bloody sheet. I think she's trying to just muddy the waters here, trying to keep Cersei's paranoia nice and fueled. But probably Margaery and Renly did sleep together. I mean, not just because people were watching. I mean, it's like, well, why? How could they? I mean, well, Renly would want an heir, and Margaery would want an heir, and everyone else would want an heir. Everyone connected to that. They would want to have kids, even if it's not, his preference for sexual orientation. He's still a man that understands power, and to have an heir is really important. So I think there's a good chance he still, did his duty, so to speak. And it makes him a little bit like his brother, doesn't it, Stannis? So it's also possible that he was turned on because Loras was right there and being one of the one carrying him around. So whatever works. And she also implies that Margaery and Loras might be sleeping together, which of course is nonsense. And she has to know about Jaime and Cersei. So, or at least suspect it, like so many people do. So dropping these heavy hints is like a neat way of judging how she's going to react. Like, how would Cersei react to hearing about another incestuous relationship? Is she more likely to believe it because it's something that she herself has done? Even though it's really, in a vacuum, it's a crazy thing to happen. A very outlandish, strange, bizarre occurrence for twins to hook up like that. To someone in the middle of it, it may seem less weird, especially given how often they think about Targaryens and all that. So this might be an attempt to bait her or to further drive a wedge between the two families. It depends a bit on who Taena's really working for, doesn't it? Because one thing's for sure, she's not working for herself. That's what Cersei thinks, which by itself is a clue it's wrong. But really, the idea that Taina's working for herself or just for herself and her husband, I think is pretty crazy. She's moving up the line here with all these ambitious moves, like these kind of dangerous moves. And she's not bringing her son to court. That's something that comes up this chapter, that if she was working on personal ambition here, having her son befriend Tommen is a great power move. It's an obvious power move. Cersei recognizes it as that, and that's why she kind of brushes it off that Taina rejects it, because she's like, oh, surely she wants this. She can't fathom Taina not wanting this because she doesn't fathom Taina being against her, which is pretty straightforward. So, but who is Taina working for? The main options are like Littlefinger, Tyrells, Varys. I think of those three, by far, Varys is the most likely. I think it's popular to think the Tyrells, but Taina does a lot of things that undermine the Tyrells, that aren't really good for them. For example, this suggestion that Loras and Marjorie might be sleeping together, that's not a good rumor to have spread out in the world for the Tyrells. They don't want that, even though they know, and it's silly and not true. They don't need that said. They don't need that spoken. They don't need that rumor out there. And that's just one example. This is something I don't want to go into massive detail for because it's a deep, deep rabbit hole. So I encourage you to look this up on your own and think about who it might be. But Varys has been trying to keep the Lannisters and Tyrells apart since Ned was Hand. Remember, he said outright and suggested it, having Loras go arrest Gregor instead of Beric, because he knows there's bad blood between those two after the tournament, and Loras using his trick against Gregor. That's sure to cause those two to fight. Gregor would want revenge, and then all of a sudden you might have Lannisters and Tyrells on the opposite side. So Varys has been trying to accomplish that for a long time. It's one of the things he hasn't been successful on. He's been successful on so many other things, but this one he couldn't stop.
I should bring it, I think it's worth mentioning, I don't think we get into it much, but about House Merryweather. Yeah. Because they kind of have something against the Targaryens and the Baratheons.
Yeah, good point. Right?
Because Owen Merryweather was the hand to Aerys, and he wasn't killed, but he was stripped of a bunch of stuff. But then Robert, still didn't give them everything back.
Yeah, he gave them some of it back. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so they might want the rest of their lands back. Sort of like the same Connington-Harrenhal thing we talked about, where they were given some of their lands back, but some of it was given away. So they want to get back all of it. So that's a great point.
To be fair, also the Targaryens raised them up a couple of times.
Yeah. True as well. It's also just another Aerys-Cersei parallel, right? They both have a Merryweather from, as their hand. So Cersei thinks too how the Tyrells might be in league with Tyrion, but really it's Taina that she should be worried about and who she's working with. And so again, Cersei doing the similar thing Jaime is doing, but with much greater consequences. She's not aware of where the real threats are, whereas Jaime is simply overvaluing Cersei's cheating on him compared to other big problems. So let's think about this for a second. This is a little bit we can call the Lion Pirates. Here's a quote.
Her flagship would dip twice as many oars as King Robert's hammer. Owain had asked her leave to name her Lord Tywin, which Cersei had been pleased to grant. She looked forward to hearing men speak of her father as a she. Another of the ships would be named Sweet Cersei, and would bear a gilded figurehead carved in her likeness, clad in mail and lion helm, with spear in hand. Brave Joffrey, Lady Joanna, and Lioness would follow her to sea, along with Queen Marjorie, Golden Rose, Lord Renly, Lady Olenna, and Princess Myrcella.
Think of these names as one of the biggest signs of Tyrell claws in Tommen, says Joe Buckley. I got to agree with him. 5 of them are named after roses. Well, if you count Renly, which is just kind of odd that any of them are named after Renly.
Yeah, that is odd. I also think it's really interesting that Cersei has her likeness clad in mail and lion helm.
Yeah, right? It can contrast
with a spear.
Contrast to like Euron's figurehead, or this same thought she's having about Lord Tywin's ship being a she. So she's really just leaning into all that, and her own self-hatred of her gender is a big issue here. So that's neat. I like that. That's a really good theme that's being touched on here in a clever way. Also, her thought about notice that her ship will have twice as many oars as King Robert's hammer. She's just like all this one-upsmanship with the ships, but she's not seeing the one-upsmanship of her with all the Tyrells. It's funny. It's really funny how misfocused she gets so regularly. 1 second she's like, "Oh, the Tyrells," and then she's thinking about the ships, and she doesn't think too much about how so many of them are Tyrell named, even because she's more focused on, her father and King Robert, and how they're getting one-upped, even though they're dead.
Who was it that said this just now? Aegon the Sixth said Tommen gets no ship names after him.
That's funny. Yeah, he didn't name one. He didn't choose one of his own.
Yeah, that's kind of sad to me. Tommen deserves one more. Like Cersei made Lioness.
Yeah, I remember too that one of them was going to be Moon Boy.
Yeah,
and that one was changed to Lady Olenna. I mean, imagine, it's funny that Cersei went with that. She's like, you can't name it Moon Boy. They're like, okay, Lady Olenna. Like Cersei's okay with that.
Lord Renly and not King Tommen.
Yeah.
You think Tommen should have gone with Sir Pounce, the ship?
Yeah, right. Speaking of Sir Pounce, I neglected to mention last time when he got his kittens, how cool of a little theme that is. He gets 3 black kittens. Tommen gets 3 black kittens, where Joffrey had Sandor Clegane, who's a member of House Clegane, whose sigil is 3 black dogs. There you go. Pretty cool. So Marjorie shows up at the end of this one, and we see more how she is just so different from Cersei in so many ways, in ways that Cersei really is uncomfortable with. It makes Cersei jealous. Not just the queen who's younger and more beautiful part. That's certainly in play because of the prophecy. But prophecy aside, Cersei doesn't have friends. She thinks about how she had that one friend until she, quote, fell into the well that you shoved her into. And meanwhile, Marjorie has a ton of friends. She's always surrounded by people and buddies and hangers-on, and the commoners love her, whereas the commoners do not love Cersei. So she's just winning. She's got these angles of power that Cersei doesn't have access to that really makes her nervous, really makes her, puts her off her game and makes her more paranoid. And it's part of why she's just really wants to get Marjorie, because a lot of it's jealousy. Here's a quote: "Make way, clear the street, make way for her grace the queen." That's, of course, while she's in her litter and all that. And that's gonna be, Joe points that out as foreshadowing for soon she's gonna be walking through the streets naked, and they're still gonna have to make a way for her, but it's gonna be, for much different circumstances. Instead of her having the right of way because she's in charge, she's basically put on the lowest social rung, temporarily placed below even the lowest of the low, who are allowed to throw filth and stuff at her. Fitting for a chapter with majorly important progressions, begins with Cersei still being obsessed with her Marjorie plan. We've talked about that all throughout this chapter, but she's basically, the way Joe puts it is that she's essentially uncaring about the rest of the world. She's so focused on winning this battle with Marjorie that she sloughs off so many other responsibilities. She thinks everything is going to be great as long as Marjorie is defeated. And it makes it obvious to Taena that she has this weakness. The fact that she goes on and on about Marjorie and is like, can I get her to sleep with this guy? Can I trick her this way? Like, it's just, Taena's taking all this in and going, okay, well, this is clearly your weakness, isn't it? Among others. Here's a really funny quote. Not the Butterfly Night one. I already did that one. Shay, the one after it, yeah.
"When she saw what they had done to Baelor the Beloved, the queen had cause to rue her soft heart."
There's that Lannister sarcasm again. Cersei knows she doesn't have a soft heart. And Joe says, that's quite a comical line about Cersei genuinely thinking she has a soft heart, or sarcastically thinking, when we come to Baelor, we find the literal manifestation of the title of the book. I pulled a quote here. It says, where is it? Down here in the miscellaneous. The book, a crow sat atop one such, enjoying a dry, leathery feast. Leathery, book, crow, feast. Yep, it's all there. Well done, George. So, but it's not coincidence, Joe says, that we find this same spot that Eddard was murdered, almost as if the fates are saying this is the direct result of that crime. This is the world they've created. And it's a great move by the Faith. It's a loud statement decrying the war that's been about and how it's affected the humble. Like, this war has just been devastating, and they're not going to let anyone miss this fact. They want everyone to know how devastating it's been, and that means blaming the Lannisters, or at least them taking the lion's share of the blame. So Cersei finally kneels and has to, it's part of her subjugation a bit, her being forced to do things she doesn't want to do because the Faith has all this power, because the High Sparrow is clever and understands how politics works. He has a great political mind. It reminds me a little bit of Victarion kneeling in the surf to get blessed by Euron. He's in full armor, thinks about how the seawater's going into his boots and down his hair. He doesn't care. Just very different ways of interacting and with the religion and with the trappings of religion and what they value. Like, Cersei's worried about her gown when, like, who cares? Why does she care about her gown? I mean, there's way more important things going on in the scene. That shouldn't matter to her at all. Like, whether or not her gown is going to be impacted. Like, it's definitely beside the point. Nina says George is setting up the Anne Boleyn-esque accusations against Marjorie with the introduction of singers, spending a lot of time with her, because that is a big part of the real world story around Anne Boleyn. We've got this court hangers-on, handsome young knights. That was part of the accusations against her. The inclusion of Marjorie's cousins also sets up the same parallels, because this is the Tour de Nestle affair depicted in The Accursed Kings, which Nina will have some details on that when we get closer to it. And it also touches on the very strange vow taken by this Lambert Turnberry guy who is wearing an eye patch that he doesn't need, kind of like Euron, except for otherwise not at all like Euron. he won't take the eye patch off until Tyrion is taken or whatever. So you have similar weird vows like that in the real world story of the Tour de Nestle affair, which, like I said, we'll explain more later. The real world influence there is very powerful. Cersei mentions the rumor that the future Viserys II had the stonemason High Septon murdered, but quite possibly he had this child High Septon murdered as well. There's a lot of rumors around Viserys II having people killed, and Viserys, before he was Viserys II, he was Hand of the King. He has a lot in common with Tywin, in fact. And he may have even murdered Baelor himself, only to perhaps be murdered by his own son, Aegon the Unworthy, pardon me. And let's see, what else do we have here? A few more thoughts. Cersei's attitude towards the Sparrows feels very reminiscent of Rhaenyra's attitude towards the rioters in King's Landing at the end of the dance. This is interesting. Check out how Rhaenyra behaves and what she says here. Quote.
The queen did not believe it. They are vermin, drunks and fools and gutter rats. One taste of dragon flame and they will run.
At that the fool mushroom spoke up, saying, Drunks they may be, but a drunken man knows not fear. Fools, aye, but a fool can kill a king. Rats, that too, but 1,000 rats can bring down a bear. I saw it happen once down there in Flea Bottom. Yeah, that's really true. Remember what she when Taena expresses fear, she's like, oh, they're just rats. They won't harm a lion. Well, here we have rats instead of sparrows, bear instead of lion. It's really similar. And don't forget, we have quotes like when the waif is explaining basilisk blood to Arya and how that is something that makes people go crazy. A mouse will attack a lion off of a taste of basilisk blood. So, well, what about 1,000 mice? There is even, in fact, a theory that basilisk blood was added to the city water to make the crowd go crazy. That maybe isn't necessary, but it's worth considering. And I mean that to apply to both of these, whether that applied to the King's Landing riot in A Clash of Kings or in the riots during the Dance of the Dragons. I'm very skeptical basilisk blood had anything to do with the one in Clash of Kings, but maybe in the Dance of the Dragons it's possible. But I think that's more likely just humans behind the scenes working the crowd up, doing things, and making it work for them. Nina points out Cersei can't even keep her own paranoia straight. She's worried in Jaime's chapter about the Dornish allying with Tyrion because Oberyn championed Tyrion. But when Cersei considers the Tyrell part in killing Joffrey, she thinks the Tyrells are hiding Tyrion and Sansa at Highgarden. So it's not that she is contradicting herself so much as that she's so paranoid and thinking through these things. She just focuses on all these different angles of how the various different ways Tyrion could be out to get her, even though they couldn't possibly all work together. It's just such a major focus for her to think about where Tyrion is, what he's doing, and just like Jaime not thinking about certain things and focusing more on her, she's doing kind of the same thing with Tyrion. Brandon Winslow says, random, Sir Lambert the fool who hides a good eye behind an eye patch makes him think of Euron who hides a functional eye, and his good eye is referenced in the next chapter. Yeah, absolutely. It's pretty neat. Like, the characters don't have that much in common, but it is a neat little parallel.
They're both
no matter
fools.
Yeah, it is weird to wear an eye patch that you don't need. Although there are other reasons for it that aren't necessarily weird, and we go into that in the Euron Greyjoy episode.
Yeah, they're actually pretty interesting.
Yeah, like real-world sailory stuff, and even pilots do these things. Cersei, Archmaester Emma with a great take here. She points out that Cersei could have, in her back and forth with the High Sparrow, she could have brought up sending Bonifer Hasty to Harrenhal. It's like, look, we're sending this here. We're working with this group that you would approve of. Nice little, that's a good take there. It's another example of something that wasn't said or wasn't mentioned that could have been. It could have been important. And
one more thing. A lot of you probably know this, but we brought up Anne Boleyn briefly. And Brandon Winslow reminds us that Anne Boleyn was played by Natalie Dormer, Marjorie Tyrell on The Tudors.
I can't believe I didn't think to say that.
Yes.
I didn't watch the whole thing all the way through.
Me
The Tudors.
either, but I watched enough to have seen her.
Yeah, I did remember that. She was really good in that role. Really good.
I can believe it. She was really good as Marjorie, who has a little bit of shades of that.
Unfortunately, Jonathan Rhys Meyers was not a very good Henry. George R. R. Martin flat out said he was bad. He wasn't very good on Vikings either, but it was a better role for him because it was a more intense, straightforward role, which is what that guy. We called him the Batman Knight. He's like, I will, yeah. Like, and even when he's in an intimate scenario, he's like, I love you.
We're gonna get all these comments from Jonathan. Whatever
he's gonna hear we called him out. I think he did a fine job there, but still, these things happened. Yeah, I didn't like him as Henry Jordan, but I wouldn't go as far as George, though. Anyway, let's move on to the Reaver. The most powerfully named chapter, perhaps. Conquest of the Shields, a.k.a. Euron's Shady Dreams. The start of Euron's reign, it says, fast and sudden as this attack. Neither first-time readers nor the Shield Islanders themselves could see it coming, quite literally. But on reread, the action is still excellent, but the mysteries and lore are so much clearer and deeper. Shade of the Evening, the Dragonhorn, Skin Changer vibes, the setup for Victarion's firearm, and the notion that he'll place R'hllor up there with the Drowned God. We've got some ideas on foreshadowing here that will be new to most of you. This chapter is just chock full, and I think a lot of people just kind of were like, yeah, this is all right the first time through, but man, does it hit hard on a reread. Also, this one sets up Victarion's morph into quite the travelogue character. He becomes a lot more interesting when he's on the other side of the world, and so do his surroundings. Not that I don't think he's interesting now. He's not a personally interesting character, but everything happening around him is interesting. I don't expect him to succeed in his process of capturing Daenerys and making her his own, but it's gonna be fun. And here's the first line.
The drums were pounding out a battle beat as the Iron Victory swept forward, her ram cutting through the choppy green waters.
That's a more exciting than average first line of a chapter, for sure. It's certainly more exciting than the king was pouting.
But not quite as good.
Maybe not as good. You may prefer one to the other, but yeah. They're very different. We were among those who referred to the show version of Euron as a combo of book Euron and Victarion mixed in with, I don't know, something entirely else. The pictures show Euron in that night battle against the Dornish fleet, where he's the first one off the ship onto the enemy deck. He's laying about with that pretty sweet axe we dubbed the Craxon. Euron was like having fun in that scene, and that's pretty much what Victarion's doing right here. Quote,
He vaulted over the gunwale, landing on the deck below with his golden cloak billowing behind him. The White Roses drew back, as men always did at the sight of Victarion Greyjoy, armed and armored, his face hidden behind his kraken helm. They were clutching swords and spears and axes, but 9 of every 10 wore no armor, and the 10th had only a shirt of sewn scales. These are no iron men, Victarion thought. They still fear drowning. Get him, one man shouted. He's alone.
Come, he roared back. Come kill me if you can. There are those who are good at fighting, and there's those who love fighting, and there are some who are both. Brandon Stark loved the Song of Swords, we're told. Jaime Lannister as well, clearly, when he could. Recall how alive and happy he was in that very short time when he dueled Brienne in his POV. Robert Baratheon's another pretty clear example. That guy loved to fight. It wasn't a matter of duty or honor or protecting his house or reputation. I mean, he did those things sometimes, but mostly it was just, he just liked to fight. That was the bottom line for him. Rhaegar was skilled, but learned skills from necessity and a sense of duty and perhaps prophecy. He wasn't into it so much, and he didn't seem to be a killer either. Brienne likes fighting, and as we've already seen, she won't hesitate to kill, but she's not a killer. She's got too much conscience for that, and she believes in a fair fight. Bronn, on the other hand, has no conscience and probably doesn't really like fighting so much as he likes winning, which means killing. He doesn't seek out fair fights either. Victarion is a strange mix of these features. He's honest to goodness, loves to fight and kill, but he's not as big on it being easy. He wants challenges. He thinks how he would give half his teeth to fight the Knight of Flowers or the Kingslayer. Like, that is intense. He wants glory, but the Ironborn version of glory is very different than that of the North or what's preached by knighthood. So different ideals, but he is a champion of those ideals. Lyn Corbray is another one worth mentioning here, a man who's great at fighting, but particularly likes killing. Victarion wants to fight Loras Tyrell. Lyn Corbray wants to kill Loras Tyrell. Victarion wants the glory of beating a renowned foe. Lyn Corbray wants reputation from killing renowned foes. His most famous kill was a wounded Kingsguard, after all. Someone like Corbray or Bronn doesn't really care how they win as long as they win. Ditto Euron, I'm sure. But Victarion has strange parallels to characters who don't really seem like him in that he kind of prefers a fair fight. But not entirely, just sort of. He also has interesting differences from characters who have more in common with him on the surface. Part of why I think he's actually a pretty interesting character, despite being seemingly kind of straightforward and not good ways. Lyn Corbray seems like the type to spit on his opponent's corpse after he's killed him or insult them, while Victarion thinks that's shameful. He seems to think the gods are watching at all times. It's not that he's inwardly good, it's he thinks that he's being judged at all times. And yes, I said gods, not God, because Victarion believes in pretty much all of them. He holds the drowned god above the rest is all. Well, he will until he gets his burned arm. Then he's going to start talking about two gods and such, or the two gods and such.
He's actually not, I mean, he's dumb in a lot of ways, but in that, he's not, I think. I mean, when you see there's magic and gods, it makes sense to be like, well, there could be more.
Yeah, he thinks about the gods often. He's a really thoughtful person, even though he's not intelligent. He spends a lot of time thinking and pondering and philosophizing. He's just not very good at it. But he gives us a lot to think about because he raises the topics. And that's part of why his inner monologue is actually so interesting, despite, again, him being a total brute. So I think that's the heart of it, though. We mentioned all those people and their interest in fighting or lack of. None of those people are religious. Maybe you could say Rhaegar believed in prophecy, and Brienne believes in the gods, but she's not super devout or anything, right? She doesn't think about them that often. But Victarion is just like we just said. He is just constantly thinking about what would the gods do, what's right and what's wrong, what do the gods see like Euron would know. You know, it's just constantly on his mind. He's very serious. And that's kind of why I likened him to Sir Boniface Hasty. The world is a certain way. That's a man like him is just like, this is how it is. You can't change it. You can't fight it. The gods do what they will, must be appeased. They have authority over us. Nothing changes that. He was put on this earth to kill, and he has deep-seated confidence in this, both in coming from a long line of similar men, but because he has so very little imagination for anything else. Quote. Yeah.
The drowned god had not shaped Victarion Greyjoy to fight with words at Kingsmoot, nor struggle against furtive, sneaking foes in endless bogs. This was why he had been put on Earth, to stand, steel-clad, with an axe red and dripping in his hand, dealing death with every blow.
It's such a very strange contradiction. He's extremely serious about hierarchies and authority and rules. He thinks how deeply obedience is rooted in him, how habitual it is for him. He sees bodies going off for burial, and it disgusts him. Because how can they reach the drowned god's watery halls if they're buried? He's super deeply rooted in his own culture and takes it extremely serious. I'm just fascinated by this. He's a brutish killer, but he adheres to very strict codes of behavior. They just aren't very good codes. They're codes that we would denigrate as immoral and evil. He kills, but he respects people who he kills, because you're supposed to respect bravery in his world order that he follows. So it's a frequent theme, as I was just saying to Ashea. He wrestles with moral codes and rules and just thinks about this a lot. Here's a good example. Quote,
"If I do not strike the blow with mine own hand, am I still a kinslayer?" Victarion feared no man, but the drowned god's curse gave him pause.
He probably feared no man also. Again, this is part of why I think I like him. He's an idiot, but like I said to Shea, he's extremely thoughtful. He spends all his time pondering and philosophizing and judging. I mean, he pours wine into the sea for the men who died.
Yeah,
on either
one
side.
for my homies.
Yeah, for his homies. Yeah,
That is so funny, really.
yeah.
Pour some out.
He does. He pours some out for the homies. When told they're selling their captives for slaves instead of taking them as thralls, he thinks it's not the old way. Like, there's not that big a difference between thralls and slaves, but to him, this is a huge difference because one is the correct way and one is the wrong way. He doesn't really sit there and judge the difference. He just knows that the rules say this,
I remember
and they don't say that.
When Sean sent us his message about this one, he basically was like, "That's BS. What's the difference?"
Exactly. He also thinks there's no joy in life at all until the drowned god's watery halls, which is a really dangerous mindset for everyone else. Expecting that, I mean, his worldview is that everyone is meant to suffer greatly until the afterlife. That is not the type of attitude that lends itself to compassion or valuing other lives. He realizes Euron and his men could be easily slain. He thinks of all these different people. He's like, that guy could kill Euron. I could kill Euron. It'd be easy. Wolf One Ear could do it. Newt the Barber, no problem. Euron can't take him. But to actually do it is unthinkable. It would be kinslaying for him to do. It would be kinslaying for him to order. So it's just off the table. He might hope someone does it, and like, if I'm lucky, someone will kill him. But he's not going to take any action to make it happen himself. It suggests to me that if Victarion were like Robb Stark's younger brother, with Ned Stark as his father, he'd have been maybe not a good person, but at least an asset to a decent family. I mean, this isn't like Varys telling Kevin that he's a good man in service to a bad cause. In part because I don't think Kevin's a good man either, but that's beside the point. The guy is too brainless to have original thoughts. He does what he's told by his elders, by his god, by the dictates of his culture. So if he had been taught as a boy that reaving was a sin, that rape was an abomination, well, then maybe he'd be Sir Bonifer Hasty, joyless, zealous, rigid, still has problems with women, still a misogynist, competent, if not skilled at war and related activities, but still much less of a threat to humanity. Bonifer Hasty, we criticize plenty, but you'd definitely rather have a Bonifer Hasty than a Victarion Greyjoy running around. That's not close. But Bonifer Hasty had, if not good upbringing, better upbringing. Victarion was Balon's brother and Euron's brother. These are the people influencing him. His culture is dedicated to the old way, which is all about violence and rape and taking and not making. These are the rules he follows. Violent, awful people are so much worse and more dangerous when organized and led by smart, ambitious, also violent, awful people. Here he is again, our thick philosopher, quote.
I got lost putting in a question. Okay. There is no wine so sweet as wine taken from a foe. Someone had told him that once. His father or his brother Balon. One day I shall drink your wine, crow's eye, and take from you all that you hold dear. But was there anything Euron held dear?
No, not really. That's the crux of the problem. That's part of why Euron is so powerful and dangerous. Not only does he know what you care about, tries hard to know what you care about, and then uses it against you, he's mostly immune to that tactic in reverse. Yeah, what does he hold dear besides like his life? And he may not even hold that terribly dearly. Interestingly, this thought process is another thing that ties him to Jaime. Jaime in his chapter thinks about getting some advice, and he can't recall whether it was Sumner Crakehall or his father. Similarly, like Jaime, Victarion thinking, was it his brother or his father? So they're very much beholden to more powerful, more cruel and dangerous siblings. That is Jaime and Victarion. Jaime's being kind of controlled by Cersei, even though he knows she's doing bad things. He just can't seem to do anything about it. She's just dominating him in those ways. And as far as authority goes, same thing here. Victarion knows Euron's bad news. He knows his gifts are poisons. He knows his brother's bad news, but he's following the rules. He's stuck with the rules here. And these parallels could get even more interesting if Euron and Cersei ever ally or hook up or anything like that. If we give Victarion and Jaime parallels still, although I kind of expect Victarion would be dead by that point. And so this quote here, you just added, Ashea, until there comes another younger, more beautiful to cast you down and take all that you hold dear?
Yeah, I just thought that should be in there. Because obviously that's exactly what is said in the Reaver chapter.
Yeah, that's true.
Literally, he says, one day I shall drink your wine, crow's eye, and take from you all that you hold dear.
Good point.
That is exactly what this quote from Cersei's prophecy, it says, until there comes another, younger and more beautiful, to cast you down and take all that you hold dear.
Great point. Yeah,
the only times that's said.
Maggie the Victarion. That's crazy. I didn't ever catch that. Good one. Nice. So Victarion does hold things dear. Not many, but some, and this is one of the lessons of Euron. It can always be worse. Victarion is awful, but Euron is way worse. Just like Asha, who has seen some of the worst there is, has a hard time with people being burned alive. It's like she's seen some awful things, but it can always be worse. Even Cersei gets a bit ill thinking of what Qyburn does to his victims, because as bad as she is, well, she can always go sink lower, and by meeting Qyburn, she is sinking lower, although that's not the only reason. Still, it's a good example. The scene of the victory dinner is one of the more difficult to read parts of a chapter in the entire series. Like I said, it can always be worse. We've been through some hard to read scenes, and this one's particularly tough in a way because what's being done to these women and girls, no one's even killed. We're just like, no one's even killed. I'm not downplaying what happened to them, but it's amazing that through so many books, so many awful things have happened, rarely do we feel so uncomfortable reading about what's happening without death. I know someone that quit the books over this scene. Even Victarion, again, clearly awful person, looks at what's happening with Lord Hewitt's daughters and family and thinks this is going too far, way too far. And again, he's somewhat typical of his culture. So if he's typical of his culture and thinks this is going way too far, then that says a lot. Yet everyone's going along with it. Again, this is an interesting point to show that it can always get worse. Asha, Theon, Euron, and Aeron are all kind of outliers within their culture. Victarion is kind of the middle child, not only as a character in terms of representing his culture, but in terms of actually being the middle child, in terms of who's alive now, is Euron, Victarion, and Aeron. Whereas, Ned was a middle child, Stannis was a middle child. It's really common to see this serious lack of joy, rigid type characters as middle children. That's a real world trope that George is drawing on. And he's so brilliant, George is, at drawing comparisons in human archetypes and behaviors across multiple cultures, showing how people are products of their culture and family and how the structure of this world creates these recurring parallel themes, right? People of Victarion's ilk are produced by the Ironborn because of the nature of their culture. A person like Victarion couldn't really be born, even though I parallel him to Sir Bonifer Hasty. There's so much different about them because, well, Bonifer Hasty was brought up in an entirely different situation. Even Roose Bolton doesn't know what the gods expect a person to do when his son kills his other son, Roose won't kill his own son, I don't think. So think about that. Euron is beyond even like Roose or Ramsay in how far he's willing to go and in the scope of his ambition. I mean, Roose's goal is like king of the North, maybe. That seems to be the extent of it. I mean, he would probably want more if he could get it, but that seems to be what he's focused on. Whereas Euron's like, Victarion asks him what he wants, and he says, the world. Wow, right? Birth and circumstance impact life outcomes majorly, and that's why Victarion, and that's why I'm drawing these comparisons between Victarion and Jaime and Sir Bonifer Hasty and where they were born. But beyond all this, none of those other characters, Jaime, even with comparisons to Cersei and Euron, even with Bonifer Hasty and his situation, none of this compares to the extreme case of Euron. He's just so beyond it all. He's so much more manipulative, so much more skilled, so much more sadistic. And we get to Euron and Victarion talking about it. Euron has serious buyer's remorse. But Victarion, again, just is like, well, we can't do anything. The rules are the rules. He won, blah, blah, blah. And here's the quote.
Euron gave him a baleful look, the look that had been known to sour wells and make women barren.
Okay.
A little humor there. It was not the god who spoke. Euron is known to keep wizards and foul sorcerers on that red ship of his. They sent some spell among us, so we could not hear the sea.
Indeed, he does keep that on his ship, and you'll be joining them soon, Euron. Victarion asks him how he plans to fight back against Euron without men or ships, and Euron says he will use his voice. Your voice against Euron, the guy who captains the Silence, the tongue cutter? It's like his theme, man, to silence people. Your voice is no weapon at all. And he doesn't really even get much of a chance, though. His voice never even gets, like, deployed, so to speak. Here's what happens.
When the sun came up the next day, Euron Greyjoy had vanished from Old Wick. Even his drowned men knew not where. They said the Crow's Eye only laughed when he was told.
Yeah, he laughed because he knows where he is. In the first second, we learn that he goes to pray. And then when he returns to shore, because of course he's praying out in the water, Euron's men are waiting for him. And they club him and take him below deck on Silence. And that's pretty much where he's been, other than occasionally spending time in some castle dungeons while being moved around. Victarion thinks he's back on the Iron Islands when his priestly brother is actually quite close by in Euron's ship. What Euron has done with the new lords of the Shield Islands is straightforward enough under examination that even Victarion understands it. Quote,
Victarion had expected the Crow's Eye to give the lordships to his own creatures, Stonehand and the Red Oarsman and Left-Hand Lucas Cod. A king must needs be open-handed, he tried to tell himself. But another voice whispered, Euron's gifts are poisoned. When he turned it over in his head, he saw when he turned it over in his head, he saw it plain. The knight was the reader's chosen heir, and Andric the unsmiling the strong right arm of Dunstan Drum. Volmark is a callow boy, but he has Black Heron's blood in him through his mother. And the barber. Victarion grabbed him by the forearm.
refuse him!
Newt looked at him as if he had gone mad. Refuse him? Lands and lordship? Will you make me a lord?
He's weakening the powerful men that were opposed to him, right? Newt was Victarion's best man on his long voyage in his to the east. His new second command becomes Wolf One-Ear, who he actively thinks of as capable, but clearly lesser than Newt. And in the other cases, it's pretty straightforward. The knight was Reader's chosen heir and a supporter of him. Andric the Unsmiling was the strong right hand of another guy who stood at the King's Moot, Dunstan Drum. And Drum, we see talking to the Reader, kind of worrying about the big picture here, saying, okay, they took the shields, but now we have all of the Reach angry at us, and how are we going to deal with that? So he's removing power from the people that are against his plans, that stood against him at the King's Moot, things like that. And as we also know or see later, he is totally intending to throw these guys away. He's not just peeling them off from their current leaders, but he's expecting them to die. it's confirmation that Victarion was right to tell Newt not to accept Euron's poison gifts. In the Forsaken chapter, it's very well explained. As Aeron talks to Euron below decks, your victories are hollow. You cannot hold the shields.
Why should I want to hold them? His brother's smiling eye glittered in the lantern light, blue and bold and full of malice. The shields have served my purpose. I took them with one hand and gave them away with the other. A great king is open-handed, brother. It is up to the new lords to hold them now. The glory of winning those rocks will be mine forever. When they are lost, the defeat will belong to the 4 fools who so eagerly accepted my gifts.
Okay, then. There you have it. That's... There's no mishing around there. He's like, yep, I'm screwing these guys over. Poison gifts, yep, no doubt. He has no intention of trying to keep those islands. None whatsoever. And he gives the men who are keeping them very little to do so. Last we hear, Garland Tyrell broke off his pending attack on Brightwater Keep, which is, according to decree, his, but technically still in the possession of the Florents, Colin Florent in particular. So he's making this his priority to take the shields back. So whether he'll succeed or not, we'll see. I kind of expect he will, given that Euron is not trying, but it could be interesting. Meanwhile, this will lead indirectly and almost immediately to Sir Loras' assault on Dragonstone. All of a sudden, everyone's attacking islands, right? So is this foreshadowing here, I wonder? This is moving on a little bit, but I wonder. This is curious. Quote,
Drum nodded, one hand on the hilt of his red rein.
Lord Tarley bears the great sword Heartsbane, forged of Valyrian steel, and he is always in Lord Tyrell's van.
Victarion's hunger flared. Let him come. I will take his sword for mine own, as your own forebear took Red Wayne. Why did I do Victarion this time?
I don't know. You did that underline, didn't you?
Yes, dumb. It's very dumb.
Not that I think he's going to fight Randall Tarley specifically, but in a short span, he twice thinks about facing Valyrian steel. Here's the next one. 7, you say?
Victarion wondered how Nightfall would fare against his axe. He had never fought a man armed with a Valyrian steel blade. Surprising.
Right? Yeah. Well, I wonder if that's foreshadowing. He's going to fight someone with Valyrian steel or acquire it, or I don't know. It just comes up twice in a short span. Maybe it's just coincidence. I don't know. But it's curious for sure. The number 7, though. He says 7, you say. And 7, well, as a superstitious guy, 7 is meaningful. Not just because it's a lot of foes to beat in successive single combat, as the knight does, which he's like, nice. As always, Victarion appreciates feats of arms, but 7 is a superstitious number. He's going to sacrifice 7 women in A Dance with Dragons when he captures that ship of sex slaves. Euron seems to want to leverage the jubilation of his victory into getting his people fired up about going after Dany. We see at first that he seems to have overestimated. It's an interesting moment. Euron actually misjudges a bit. With that minor weakness exposed and the crowd in disagreement with the plan, they're like, I don't want to go east. That's crazy. And there's plenty for us to take here. Why go east when the Arbor's right there? We just cleared out the Mander. What about Old Town? They don't understand. They're kind of like Victarion. They lack imagination. They see what's in front of them. They go for the traditional targets. With that disagreement happening, the reader takes it a little further, challenging Euron on his claim to have gone to Valyria. And this temporarily reduces Euron's authority. And Victarion even thinks, maybe this is weakening his hold on the Seastone chair already. But getting ahead of yourself there, Victarion. Euron is far too clever for that. It's only a temporary setback. It only takes him like a couple hours to get back on track. It's definitely not enough to take Euron off of the throne. It's only enough to drive him out of the room. But then, not long after that, one of Euron's sons comes, taps Victarion on the shoulder and says, hey, let's go chat in private, away from the crowd, which can be manipulated and turned against him by certain clever people like the reader. But if Victarion and Euron in a one-on-one situation, well, it's Victarion's wits against Euron's, and, well, that's no contest at all, is it? By the way, this is a sign that not all of Euron's bastard sons are mutes. If any of them are, at least that one isn't. He talked. He specifically said, my father wants to see you. So Euron cuts the tongues out of his slaves and servants, I suppose, but he hasn't done it to his sons, at least not that one. When they're alone and Euron goes to sell his revised plan, he first admits his error. He says, yeah, I forgot how petty the Ironborn were, that they'd rather stay close and attack the Arbor. And Victarion says, yeah, I agree with them. So, again, this is why Euron wants to get him alone, because he uses very old tricks, like the oldest trick in the book here against him. Quote,
Euron's smiling eye was bright with mockery. Or do I ask too much of you? It is a fearsome thing to sail beyond Valyria.
It's like, are you afraid? You chicken? Bok, bok, bok. That's what he did. It's this incredible cross-the-world journey that he's against, and all Euron has to do to get him to do it is like, what, are you afraid?
This is some Back to the Future kind of stuff.
Yeah, Victarion is Biff, isn't he? So along with that, of course, the manipulation takes a bit of a darker turn with Victarion's feelings about women, because this is a much deeper psychological wound that he has, and Euron is the one to have inflicted it on him, or rather, he deepened perhaps a wound that was already there. The recurring theme of jealousy in Victarion's chapters is mixed with this pride here of being afraid. And think about this. Joe has been really on top of pointing out the different characters and their mantras. Victarion's might be, the Crow's Eye did this, so can I. He does that. He says that about having a wizard, about mutes, about sailing across the world, about stealing Daenerys. It's just like everything is, well, he did it, so can I. But no, you can't do it because he can. He's smarter than you. He's less restricted by rules. There are things you can do he can't do. Maybe focus on those things, but nah, it's not going to happen. And I think Euron knows all of this, meaning he knows what his brother's thinking. He's been manipulating his brother his whole life and realizes how easy it is. He's quite good at it. He's had a lot of practice. The Dusky Woman is this example. This is what we mean. He's manipulating him deeply. He knows exactly what's going to happen. He knows that if he brings this woman and says, oh, if you don't take her, I'm going to kill her, he knows Victarion's going to think of his wife that he beat to death. And it's really hard, if we go back to the upbringing point for a minute, it's really hard for me to imagine a more brutal yet apt example of toxic masculinity than beating your own wife to death because you think you have to and crying while you do it, proving that you really don't want to do it, but you feel you have to. So he puts his cultural values are so owning him that he does something that he hates that scars him for life. Of course, it's far worse for the wife, but still, this just is one of the biggest condemnations of Ironborn culture that I can think of. And there's so many of them out there that you can point to, that it just really turns people into, well, it could always get worse, right there. However Victarion would have been born if he was born in some other culture, this is making the worst of it. He fears and hates mockery so much he killed his own wife. I mean, damn. This guy cried. The man who says life is pain, the man with no sentimentality whatsoever who thinks that life is nothing but suffering, he cried. Even though no one would ever mock this guy to his face, besides his brothers maybe, because he's unstoppable in combat, and you're like, oh, I wouldn't want to face him. He killed someone that he may very well have loved. He may not be able to admit to himself that he loved that wife. He may not be capable of admitting to love about anything because of his really harsh worldview, a joyless worldview. And again, Euron knows all this and uses it. He's not lying when he suggests he's a holier man than even Euron in terms of Ironborn values. The essence of the old way is taking, getting maximum value from things that you had nothing to do with making. Euron is more creative in understanding what else is there to be controlled and enslaved and how to do it. Guys like Victarion and Euron think of land and women and gold and ships and glory. That's the kind of things they want to take and own. Euron is far deeper than that, far darker than that. He doesn't just claim, I mean, he's this ultra rare type of person that does lots of drugs and doesn't just claim their mind is expanded and they have all these great ideas. He's actually got the boldness and skill to pull them off, to actually implement these plans. Most people just, do drugs and get ideas and then forget about them later. This guy is implementing them and has the skill to do it. It's interesting, too. When he suggests people, not himself, he suggests people are capable of far more than they believe about themselves, like this. Here's the quote.
"When I was a boy, I dreamt that I could fly," he announced. "When I woke, I couldn't. Or so the maester said. But what if he lied?"
Victarion, of course, doesn't understand it when it's put that way, so he clarifies and says,
Euron turned to face him, his bruised blue lips curled in a half-smile. "Perhaps we can fly. All of us. How will we ever know unless we leap from some tall tower?" The wind came gusting through the window and stirred his sable cloak. There was something obscene and disturbing about his nakedness. No man ever truly knows what he can do unless he dares to leap.
I found myself struck by this because Euron is my pick for the evilest character. But this is a legitimately good human lesson. He's like the most villainous guy saying, free your mind. Reach your potential. Actually, that's a pretty good piece of advice. And it's actually free from malice or design, too. He is trying to get Victarion to do something. But still, just that sentiment in a vacuum, make the most of yourself. In Euron's case, he's trying to make the most of being an awful person. I would prefer that Euron not make the most of himself if he were a real person. So in other words, he's saying you don't know your potential unless you actually strive for it and work towards it. Yeah, that's a pretty good lesson. So great job, George, man. He sneaks in this powerful life lesson from the least likely character. Now the magical aspects of this chapter. We've only barely touched on that. It's another huge thing going on here. Something I referred to at the beginning of this chapter that's really important, that a lot of it slides by the first time through. And then it's reinforced when you watch the TV show because they just dropped all the magic from an extremely, extremely magical plotline. It's incredible how much supernatural was taken out of this and how cool it is. But also, I kind of don't mind that it was taken out because we get to look forward to it without knowing what's coming. So, I maintain, again, that Euron sent his slaves in to Valyria, but he did go there. He just didn't necessarily set foot on the continent himself. Still,
there was that suspect Martin that we referenced just recently.
Yeah, he definitely went. It's just whether he trod on the shore or not himself, I'm still dubious of. It's certainly his way, and it also would be a wonderful parallel to what the Valyrians did. The Valyrians sent their slaves down into the harsh, burning mines to get gold and silver and all that, as we see in Arya's chapter. So it fits quite well since he's somewhat trying to revive the style of rule of Valyria, where an era of, sorcerer kings and where slavery and extreme hierarchy and authority was the rule of the lay of the land. But also what it does is allows Euron to do something he does quite well elsewhere, something that Melisandre does quite well, which is use real magic but also do clever things that he sells as magic to seem even more magical. I think he does this here with the sailing out of sight of land. Now, that's maybe part magic. I think there's a very good chance he used blood sacrifice to make the winds work a certain way, as we see Makoro do, and as we see Melisandre do. But sailing out of sight of land, that's just good seamanship. That's just smart sailing. That's just knowing what to do. There's no magic there. The winds help with that plan. But sailing out of sight of land that's just navigating without a shore. That's just like compasses and maps and things like that. There's other ways to do that. Navigating by the stars, right? You don't need that. So this is not magical. But by going to Valyria and having the ability to claim that and just sell it when we see his Valyrian steel armor, that sells it, right? Aeron is like, oh, wow, he really did go to Valyria when he sees that armor. I don't think he got the dragon horn from there, but he says he did. And who's going to challenge him on that? Because it's believable. And so I think the horn came from the warlocks, which, well, let's talk about them. He's talking about them right here. So here we go, quote.
"I mean to open your eyes." Euron drank deep from his own cup and smiled. "Shade of the evening, the wine of the warlocks. I came I came upon a cask of it when I captured a certain galley out of Karth, along with some cloves and nutmeg, 40 bolts of green silk, and 4 warlocks who told a curious tale.
Okay, so that would be Pyat Pri and his friends coming to get revenge on Dany. So yeah, a curious tale indeed. Euron leaves out the best parts there. He talks about the things that Victarion would care about, the loot. But I think he left some things out. A Dragonhorn would be a great way to get revenge on Dany if they had one. Now, see what I mean about the Ironborn. See what I mean about Euron being a true Ironborn. Most would just take the loot. They take the 40 bolts of silk, the cloves, the nutmeg. They wouldn't care about the curious tale, or if they cared, it would only be a curiosity. But as is his wont, the loot is secondary to Euron, forgettable except as a means to buy power. He stole the Warlock's plan. He stole their means of revenge. He stole them. He made them slaves. He broke them, used their powers in which we can't comprehend because we don't see it on screen. We don't know what they're capable of. We don't know what the Warlock's powers are. But we can be sure he extracted as much as he could from them through violence, through torture, through threats of more of that. They've been tortured far worse than what Ramsay did to Theon. We can see that much, at least, even if we don't see the process. We don't need to see it. We see the result. And he's not done with them. And unlike Theon, they can't escape. They're on a ship. There is nowhere to go except to maybe intentionally drown themselves. Same with Euron. He is doomed as anyone. He's as doomed as anyone who's not technically dead yet. Victarion is no good to him in such a state, on the other hand. He needs Victarion to be strong and powerful and leading that fleet to the other side of the world, which is a major, major challenge. But Victarion's not afraid of it, so... So like a true Ironborn, again, Euron takes in every way possible. Even when he's giving, he's taking, like the Shield Islands. But Dusky Woman, Phalia Flowers. He does it through a variety of means. It can be ultra-violent sadism, it can be poison gifts, it can be psychological manipulation, it can be all the above, it can be tools of the supernatural. His goal is to take dragons, after all. Woe is what he says they're good for. Can you picture a dragon in his hands? A few commenters pointed out that Dany is a comparison to Euron and how they would use their dragon. Of course, it's a natural point of comparison since she is a dragon rider and he might be. It's overwhelming, the difference there. Dany is capable of great destruction, but she certainly isn't aiming for that, at least not at this point. She may go too far. Things may get out of hand. She may blow up some wildfire, which sets off more flames. That's where I'm at with my headcanon right now. But Euron wouldn't have those qualms. He'd be like, ooh, there's wildfire here? Where? I want to hit that directly. He would aim for that, right? So again, with Euron, the lesson remains, it can always be worse. Again, let's go back to the Boltons just for a second. Give the Boltons Valyrian steel, give them dire wolves and skin changing and green seeing, and just give them artifacts and magical knowledge. Then you're getting close to Euron, and that would be kind of cool if they had all that. But they don't. Imagine Ramsay with the dragon. He still wouldn't try to take over the whole world with it, but he would be a lot more formidable. Or he would just fall right off it, maybe. I don't know. Or it would eat him. Still, not only does Euron outstrip everyone in terms of how evil he is, how unrestrained he is, he's also more ambitious, probably smarter. Yeah. Okay, cool. Sorry, folks, we had a power outage. Everything reset, our router, modem, and all that. So last thing I was saying is, not only does Euron outstrip everyone in terms of how evil he is, but he's more ambitious, smarter, far better equipped, and knowledgeable about the supernatural, etc. Well, let's talk a little more about what happens in the Forsaken as it pertains to things set up here and as it connects to direct lines as well, like this quote.
The wine of the warlocks, sweeter than your seawater, with more truth in it than all the gods of earth.
I like that as an opposing idea to the concept of Arbor Gold, which we're doing an episode on next week with Chloe from Girls Gone Canon and Drunken Song of Ice and Fire History. Arbor Gold is Sweet Lies, where this is brutal truths, heavy on the brutal, and maybe not that true, but it's what he's saying anyway. He calls himself the Storm, which is an interesting thing to call yourself when your culture is main antagonist is the Storm God. So he's kind of like, I'm the devil. Having these warlocks with him, of course, let's go back to that for a second. We quoted him stealing their plan, and I went off on talking about what that meant, but not the details of what happened. So, of course, he captures them, feeds one of them to the others. So there we are with the cannibalism again, popping up again in a place that isn't necessarily isn't related to starvation by need, but starvation that's forced. And he also mentions a dragon egg that he threw in the sea in one of his black moods. He says, now, the prevailing theory there, which I agree with, is that he threw the egg in the sea, meaning he gave it to the Faceless Men as payment to kill Balon, who was thrown into the sea. So that fits quite well. And also just isn't very credible that he would throw it into the sea literally. Like, you threw a dragon egg in the sea? It's something that's been said to be worth like astounding amounts. And I know he doesn't care about money that much, but he does value what money can get him. So that, I don't know about that. And the horn. So either the horn he got from Valyria or from the warlocks. I suspect the warlocks, because they were coming for revenge against Dany. And well, what revenge were they going to get with just their little ship and silk and cloves? Like, they needed something to get revenge on him with. None of the things described to this point would be appropriate or capable of getting revenge on Dany, but the dragon horn, that certainly would. We've just discussed why upbringing is such an important factor in all Ironborn POVs. Their overwhelmingly violent and harsh and zealous culture is at the heart of why so many of these characters are so awful. So let's talk of dreaming. This talk of dreaming impacts that. It's part of his upbringing, potentially. It's outside of that discussion from before, because Supernatural doesn't enter into, like, normal human discussions of upbringing. This is where we're purely getting into fantasy. So the talk of dreaming that he could fly, it sounds so much like what Bran hears from the Three-Eyed Crow. So a good theory, another one that I agree with, that's out there in the fandom that's pretty popular, that Euron was visited by Bloodraven in his dreams when he was very young to see if he was capable, or if he was, this Green Seer candidate that they were looking for to save the world with. We'll think that through. Maybe he kicked off Euron being what he is today through this mistake. In other words, it's the ultimate self-fulfilling prophecy. Imagine that Bloodraven, in trying to save the world by looking for the savior of the world, created the man who was going to end it. Euron, if he takes down the wall, which is entirely possible, maybe he doesn't do that if Bloodraven doesn't come to his dreams and open his mind the way it's open to these possibilities that he's now keyed in on. Did that start his long journey of thought that led him here? Or was it a key contributor? I mean, the guy was a piece of work before Bloodraven got involved, most likely. But still, there seems to be some involvement. Or maybe it's even possible that he did make Euron into what he is somehow, some sort of accident of magic, or I don't know. This would have been before we ever have any evidence of what Euron was like. I mean, we're talking about Euron as a child, and we've never seen what Euron was like as a child, other than this little bare fleeting moment. And remember, we've already talked about the evidence of Blood Seagull, checking in on Euron, perhaps at the Kingsmoot. And as far as the color themes here, Crow's Eye, for one thing, well, that's not a color, but that phrase, Crow's Eye, like 1,000 eyes in one, crows, ravens, etc. Like, it's hard not to miss that connection. His colors are red and black. Those are Targaryen colors. You can see the fit. That doesn't mean the fit is there, but you can see it. If it is there, it's set up quite well. And the seagull thing is kind of neat, too, because Bloodraven's pale white and seagulls are white. So anyway, I don't know if Euron has skin-changing abilities, latent powers of that nature. Something drew Bloodraven to him in the first place, if that's indeed what's suggested by the dialogue in this scene. I guess there's a chance that's not what's being said, but I certainly like to think it is. Interesting too. We talked about this in the theme in the beginnings, the mute making thing, and how he's a silencer, but the connection again of Victarion to Jaime, Ilian pain for Jaime, the Dusky Woman for Victarion, a sounding board for frustration and emotional problems. No sharing of secrets elsewhere because these are illiterate people with lacking another way of communicating. Probably we know that for Ilian for sure, but the Dusky Woman is more of a mystery. So we'll have more to say about her because she's coming. She'll be in several chapters with Victarion later. There's a lot of theories about who she might be. I think some of these theories probably go too far as like calling her a faceless woman and things like that. I don't know about that, but. Poor Phalia Flower. She's only 17, maybe 18 here, and Nina writes, probably never left Oakenshield in her life. If she seems cruel in this chapter, keep in mind that she's been treated as a servant probably her entire life, probably fairly cruelly. Maybe not quite this cruel, but cruel. Kept out of the main line of family, perhaps some Catelyn Jon Snow business going on here, not being allowed to be part of the family, but being present at all times. Maybe something worse than that. It's not uncommon for bastards to be treated that way. If she seems foolish for trusting Euron, keep all this in mind, though. Like, she doesn't know. She's sheltered, young, and he's extremely persuasive and dishonest and charismatic. So how could she not fall for this when she has no ability to discern and her life wasn't very good before it and someone's offering her so much more? So... what was I going to say? Yeah, so there's roughly a third of a book left here. This is the final Ironborn chapter of the book, but we'll have Asha as chapter 27 in A Dance with Dragons. Victarion doesn't come back till 57 and 64, so a very long time, but he's got a lot of sailing to do. And of course, his TWOW chapter exists as well. It's kicking off the Battle of the Fire, only partly revealed. That's a chapter that only has partly been spoiled, so wondering what the back half of that chapter looks like. A couple more notes from Joe here. As I said, it's hard, sometimes really hard for us to not jump around even within one chapter, because especially in these chapters that are of the every sentence is a rabbit hole ilk, because they all connect to each other. So no matter what topic, what a rabbit hole you go down, you end up back where you started, but in a different place. It kind of doesn't make sense exactly, but it's the amazingness of George and how all these things connect, like kraken arms and spider webs and everything. So what Joe says about the Dusky Woman is that we don't know much about her, and he's suspicious of her because of poison gifts, but despite that, he just gets to know her a bit and becomes maybe not comfortable with her. Yeah, maybe comfortable with her is the right word. He says she was taken from a slaver bound for lease. Is that true? Who knows? It could be. Not everything Euron says is a lie, but you pretty much have to suspect everything and consider it. Another thing, another example of Euron just stealing and taking and things that he didn't really earn is he takes all this credit for this plan of his that worked really well, but Victarion and Newt the Barber kind of lament that they did the dangerous, dirty work. And aren't really getting much of the glory, hardly any of it, and nor much of the financial reward while he's at it. And a couple people noticed in terms of like what's being set up and how big a deal pissing off the Reach is. This small city they take, this small town, Lord Hewitt's town, doesn't sound like a big place, but it's mentioned to be twice as big as Lordsport, or roughly twice as big as Lordsport, which is the biggest port on the Iron Islands, or at least the second biggest. Anyway, so this small Shield Island has a town larger than the largest town in the Iron Islands. That just gives you an idea of just how much bigger and more powerful and populous the Reach is, and why men like the Drum and the Reader are like, what have we gotten ourselves into? Another thing Euron uses is the Ravens against the men using the Ravens. He allows the Ravens to fly. He wants word to get out that the Shield Islands are taken, because then people will come to the Shield Islands, and meanwhile he'll be attacking somewhere else. Pretty standard Ironborn strategy, actually. Not necessarily using the Ravens this way, but striking where they're not. And he's leading them to a place so he can know exactly where they're not, which, well, it's going to end up being the Arbor after he changes his mind during this chapter. It's fitting that this chapter comes right after Cersei 6, a chapter where Cersei not only turns the historical clock back for the Faith Militant, as the Ironborn here doing with the shields. The shields haven't been really a target for the Ironborn as Conquest, maybe as for Reaving, sure, but as Conquest, they ruled them a long time ago. And yeah, so they kind of back to the old times, back to the old way, the old days and the old way. The obvious comparison to Victarion's hand, and which, of course, we talk about that being set up, his eventual burned arm, which I'm just very curious what that's going to do. Getting cut in his hand, which, well, that obviously starts here, and it's a comparison, Nina suggests, to Khal Drogo. Seemingly small wound, becomes troublesome, starts to get infected, bring in a magic person. All of a sudden, something's very different. It's not like Drogo, who is basically, a vegetable, but it is very much a matter of unintended results, or results being suggested but not delivered. If you were to ask Dany, she didn't get what she was expecting from Mirri Maz Duur vis-a-vis Drogo. Now, it's kind of maybe the opposite on the outset for Victarion. He might not, he's like, actually, my arm is stronger. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. This thing may just keep creeping up his arm, or maybe it'll kill him eventually. Who knows? I wouldn't expect that this is just done and now he just has a permanently incredible horror arm. I think it may get worse, and that may bring it, in the end, as an even closer parallel to Khal Drogo.
I would love to see an arm wrestling competition that's got Jaime and John Connington and Victarion.
Corin Halfhand.
Yeah, all of those people. Davos, everyone with something weird to do with their hands and arms.
Nina notes a joke here. Typical Victarion, dumb as a stump, which, by the way, is a phrase uttered by George R. R. Martin. He calls him dumb as a stump. Throws Cersei overboard in his armor, then thinks about what a good ransom he would make. Also, he thinks how he was a brave man, almost Ironborn. That's a compliment. Victarion thinks it's a compliment, but Cersei would be like an Ironborn. Almost Ironborn? That's not a compliment. Nina agrees that, and has little doubt in her mind that blood sacrifice is being used by Euron to affect the winds, especially just because we've seen it from other priests. We saw Melisandre do it, and like I said, and Makoro do it. So it just seems to be fairly straightforward as a power of red priests. But and we do know that he has priests in his holds and stuff, maybe, and if not warlocks, other stuff. What other notes do we have? I guess that's about it. A couple of thoughts from you guys. Princess Canius says, "You're on trouble now," with a super chat.
That was when we had our little power internet outage.
Oh, nice. Well, thanks for filling the gap with a super chat. That was cool.
I pointed out we were making comparisons between Euron and Victarion in the show.
Mm-hmm.
Euron also is all about in the show wanting to kill the Kingslayer.
Oh yeah.
And that's what Victarion's talking about right here. He wants to go against the Knight of Flowers. He wants to go against the Kingslayer.
That's true. Lady Leaf Underhill says, "I find it interesting that Victarion plans on growing old and feeble. I want their banners, too. One day he would hang them in his hall, so when he grew old and feeble, he could remember all the foes he had slain when he was young and strong." Yeah, that is interesting, because he also, he doesn't mind dying in battle and thinks it's quite possible, but he's not going to, he also is planning to live. But, yeah, I don't think he will.
And you brought up his helm. We could call this the Crack Elm?
The Crack Elm, yeah.
The cracks
nice.
in the Crack Elm.
Ooh, Dom says he liked my Victarion roar. Thanks, Dom. And Dom's a man with a good roar. He knows how to do a Clegane.
Yes.
So
he's got an amazing Stannis, an amazing Robert, and Gregor Clegane, too.
So that is high praise.
So, yes, watch Westeros, an American musical if you want to see Dom just kill it.
That is true.
And kill Oberyn.
Yes, both. Muhammad Akrat says, like Victarion, heartsick, dunk-wheeled thunder and raced back and forth before the tears of pale, cold men. Despair made him shout, "Are there no true knights among you?" Yeah, a little bit, right? There's just no, doesn't understand why, and Aaron, maybe it's more like Euron, who just doesn't understand why everyone is falling for Euron's nonsense. But Victarion is thinking the same thing, but I guess Euron is even
it's
more
also like,
beat up
as
over
in,
it.
Victarion, wants someone real to fight.
Oh, yeah, okay, I misread that. Yeah, you're right. That's true. That's a great point.
He just like, all these people, all 10 of them weren't even real enemies. They weren't real, they weren't even in armor.
Aegon the Sixth says Victarion is the younger and more beautiful.
Of course, referring to our comparison to all that you hold dear.
That's awesome, yeah. So there's comparisons to Troy here, the story of Helen of Troy. Of course, sending a fleet halfway across the world to get a beautiful woman to bring, is certainly vaguely like Troy. But it's even more that way when you realize that Cersei's next chapter, the very first line is 1,000 ships, said by Marjorie, that's how the legend was spelled, is that Helen of Troy, 1,000 ships were launched because of her face and beauty and all that. So that is, of course, there's no doubt George is well aware of the story of Helen of Troy and of Paris and Hector and Achilles and all that. So surely that's what he's thinking here. Miriam G from Facebook says maybe that's how Euron will finally die, falling to his death from leaping from a tower or being thrown from a tower, or maybe falling from Dragonback. That's an idea I throw in there. I like that. Certainly, if he gets a dragon, if the dragon dies, he could die with it or die right before it or something like that. I'm a believer that what happens to Aemond and Daemon in the Dance of the Dragons, with their two dragons clash over the God's Eye, is something foreshadowy for the main series. It could be Euron dying there, perhaps. We'll see. After all, Aemond One Eye has a blue eye and a black eye, or a missing eye. So, and that's not nearly the only thing he has in common with Euron, but that's a bit off topic.
And of course, we see Rhaegal die in some manner like that.
And we do indeed, yes. And we do see Tyrion with a white dragon piece with blood on it, which, in Victarion, Makoro tells Victarion that the horn has to be claimed with blood and all that. Lots of things pointing to something like that. Archmaester Emma with a nice catch of some wordplay, pointing out that Wolf let out a howl. Wolf, W-U-L-F-E, as in Wolf One Ear. Let out a howl. Like, nice, yep. Tree Girl with a great catch. Euron giving his speech after victory says, "We shall feast before the fall of night." Ooh, the long night perhaps being referenced there. And of course, with all this theorizing, if Euron is the one to bring down the wall or trigger the long night, given his association thematically with the Bloodstone Emperor, who supposedly caused the long night by worshiping a black stone that fell from the sky. Black stone associated with the ancient origins of the Ironborn that we've discussed at length, with their connection to the Cthulhu myths and the Deep Ones and the lands to the west, and the Seastone Chair being made of that same black stone. By the way, Victarion's going to have, in his next chapter, he's going to think about how angry he is about his missing ships. He's going to think his rage was a black stone in his belly. Like, geez, again with the black stones. It's very cool. I love it. We finish with a great joke from Archmaester Rennie, who uses imagination in a very clever way. What happens if that dragon egg really was thrown overboard and a kraken finds it and nurses it and hatches it? And then you really do have a kraken dragon. a dragon raised by krakens. Yep, I like it. Obviously, it's a joke, but it's great to imagine. Okay, folks. As predicted, these 3 chapters were far bigger than even a lot of 4-chapter slates, even though they're not as long. Last week we covered 182 minutes, 48 seconds. This week, 159 minutes, 30 seconds. So far, we've done 1,322 minutes and 40 seconds of the 2,030 minutes and 35 seconds of A Feast for Crows. We are 65.1% of the way through the book. As I said, we're just entering that final third. Effectively, that would start at 66.7. So right at the beginning of the next chapter is when we cross that. As always, you can check the video length, compare it to the edited podcast version to see how much we edited out. Today, we'll have edited out a power outage. So there's one. Of course, that'll actually get edited out of the video, too. We do edit out chunks. It's hard for us to edit out little bits of a live stream that's already published, but when we have a big chunk like that, we can cut that out.
Yeah, multiple reasons for that, but also it just looked weird with all those little jump cuts.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Again, check out our website. Ashea put a lot of work into making it an excellent way to look through old Valar Rereadis episodes. You can find exactly what chapter you want to go to, exactly what book, and it also highlights our made-up goofy titles for them, which, yeah, they're goofy, but they help you get your bearings. That is the point.
Yeah, they're very useful for me, I know for sure. Very useful. And I keep it up to date. It's got past the last week's, and I'll have it updated for you tomorrow. So
Right on. Next time, we're back to 4 chapters, and that's what we'll be doing the rest of the book. It divides evenly the rest of the way. Jaime 4, Dairy Girls, a.k.a. the one where Lancel confesses his confession.
That's got to be one of my favorites, by the way.
Dairy Girls?
Yeah, it's real good. It's such a good show. Okay. Brienne 6, The Hound is dead. Long live the Hound. A.k.a. the one at the Quiet Isle.
Cersei 7, Much Ado About Navies, a.k.a. Drinking to Forget.
And finally, Jaime 5, The Wit and Wisdom of Jenna Lannister, a.k.a. A Game of Telephones.
Yeah, 2 Jaime chapters next week. That I don't think will have happen again. I didn't actually look, but yeah, that's not likely. But we do have a lot more Jaime, so that's cool. So I mentioned the Winter is Coming to White Harbor episode. I mentioned the Euron episode. Kind of tangentially mentioned the Dragonhorn and stuff like that. So check out those episodes if you're looking for more information on some of these subtopics. Also, I mentioned Nina's blog goes into more detail on the hidden heirs and the breakdown of the riot and Varys' potential involvement, pinning him as the suspect. So lots of other stuff for you guys to do in between. But of course, make sure you catch up on the chapters. Make sure you're caught up on Valar Rereadis in general. And thanks everyone for attending. Thanks for sticking with us through the power outage. Luckily, at least it was at the end, near the end.
And I mean, that was like not even 5 minutes.
Yeah, it wasn't very long. You're right. Ashea is working so many angles every episode, handling the technology, reading the quotes, handling the chat, adding her own thoughts here and there.
Shooing the cats.
Shooing the cats away, falling out of the chair.
Yeah, falling out of the chair. I mean, I really was falling. I was trying to get Xerxes, and I just kept sliding.
Big shout out to Chuck Laws for these bad boys behind me. That's Phantomaniacs.com is his site. You can find all kinds of cool stuff.
And that is,
of course, these are Michael Klarfeld's maps, but he had them printed.
And that is FANA Maniacs.
Yeah.
And he also has merchandise for Ice and FireCon that he created right now, if you have attended it and not seen that.
We replaced the maps that have been up the last 2 weeks. We thought we got new ones, but they were really reflective. The glare was awful. So we got these printed instead, and these are so much better. The color is just like incredible.
We can travel with them.
Yeah, these can be peeled out of their frames and folded up, and because
like
they're cloth. Yeah,
they're this cloth material. So. We also have from FedEx. They decided to eat the cost on some canvas prints of it because I mean I requested matte and they did not do it.
Yeah,
but. So anyways, we'll have another set. We're going to have 3 sets of these maps, and they're massive.
Yep. So thanks also to Joe Buckley, as always, and Nina Friel for their invaluable assistance with contributions to the episode. Lots of things that I would have missed or not considered if not for them. Same goes for all of you who contribute to Flick, Facebook, Slack, and Discord. Extra special shout out to our mods in the Facebook group. That's a lot of work, moderating a Facebook group. Also, shout out to Sir Slorp, who is the creator and moderator of our Discord server. And also, of course, we mentioned Michael Klarfeld's maps here, but extra shout out for Michael. His site is claradox.de. Thanks to Kevin MacLeod for the Valar Rereadis music. Thanks to Joey Townsend and Jesse Koval for our regular music, intro and outro. Thanks to the Bengineer for making our sound quality greater than it could be. He is an actual audio engineer. I am just a guy that knows what to cut out and what not to cut out. So between the two of us, I think we do a pretty good job.
I think you do a lot more than that at this point, but sure.
Okay, maybe I'm underselling it a little bit.
I think so, but let's give Aziz props too.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And Even more, I appreciate our patrons who are the reason we're here. We couldn't possibly put all this work into the show without financial support. So thank you for being a supporter. Those of you who are, or those of you who have in the past, we're grateful for any support, whether it's now, later, or in the past. All matters, and it's all something we appreciate. Make sure to check out Here Be Dragons. We are like right at their start point right now. This is right when they're kicking off. So if you're watching this live, just head right on over. It's perfect timing. If you're hearing this afterwards, well, I'll just continue to suggest you checking out Here Be Dragons on your own if you're not a YouTube watcher. Every Sunday at 6 Eastern, they do their thing, but of course you can watch the replays.
Today they're all talking Con of Thrones, by the way.
Oh yeah, and actually we're invited to come hang out briefly.
Said
I think
he was
I might
going
do
to
that.
come on.
Yeah,
I've been telling people you were going to be on.
That's
and
right.
They said they were going to come on, check it out because you were on. So
yeah,
you better be.
I kind of slipped my mind, but I didn't make other plans. So yeah, I'm going to jump on. Yeah,
I will
absolutely.
not be because I don't want to take a shower.
Anyway, folks, thanks for coming. Thanks for listening. Thanks for supporting. Thanks for sharing. Thanks for liking. Thanks for being you. Thanks for being part of the Song of Ice and Fire community. Please stay safe. Please be as happy as you can.
Wear a mask.
Yep. And please come back next week for more Valar Rereadis.